Kalen came to on a raft made of 4 planks and realized he had only enough fresh water left for 1 day. The ropes holding the planks together had frayed, and the leftmost plank was already coming loose with every wave. And beneath the raft, a dark silhouette 3 times a man's height was slowly circling. Kalen lay motionless, listening to the wood creak. His mouth tasted of salt and blood. The last thing he remembered was the crack of the hull breaking and the cold water closing in over his head. The ship on which he served as a simple rigger was called the Wanderer and was carrying grain between the islands. A storm tore it apart in a single night. Kalen didn't know how many days he'd been drifting ever since. He propped himself up on his elbows and scanned the horizon. Water. Nothing but water in every direction. No shore, no sails, no birds. This world had sunk 300 years ago when the moon split apart and the tides devoured the continents. That's what the old bosun had told him. All that remained were the mountain peaks, now turned into islands, and the people who had learned to live on the water. Kalen clenched his teeth and checked his supplies. A water skin, 1/3 full, a fragment of a knife, a piece of tarred sailcloth. That was all. A silhouette beneath the raft rose closer to the surface, and Kalen made out a gray back and a white scar running across it. A scavenger shark. It hadn't attacked as long as its prey moved with confidence. It was waiting for a moment of weakness. Kalen forced himself to sit up straight and began to retie the raft's fastenings with the remnants of the rope. His fingers trembled with hunger. And the moment his palm touched the wet plank, a light flashed before his eyes. He recoiled and nearly fell into the water. Lines of pale golden fire hung in the air before him. The inscription stated that the carrier had been recognized and that the Fleet Shipyard had been activated. Below came the wood, 1 unit. Fiber, 0. Bone, 0. Metal, 0. Even lower, the only available structure glowed. Fortified raft, requires 6 units of wood and 2 units of fiber. Kalen blinked. The lines didn't disappear. He touched the inscription with his finger, and it unfolded into a blueprint. A raft with a gunwale, fastenings, and a recess for collecting rainwater. Kalen laughed with a dry throat, and the laughter turned into a cough. He decided he was dying and that his mind was showing him deathbed delusions. But the delusion wouldn't go away. So he put it to the test. 10 meters from the raft, a log was bobbing on the water. Kalen paddled toward it with his hands and hauled the edge of the log onto the raft. The line changed. Wood, 3 units. So the system was counting volume, not boards. That meant the log was worth 2 boards. He looked around more closely and saw something he hadn't noticed before. The sea around him was littered with debris. Splinters, scraps of rope, pieces of planking, all that remained of the Wanderer. The current was pulling everything along a single path, and he was drifting within that path. For the next few hours, Kalen worked like a man possessed. He paddled over to every piece of debris and hauled it onto the raft. The sun burned his back. Salt stung the scrapes on his palms. A shark circled closer, and he hurled a piece of plank at it. It swam away. By sunset, the counter showed 8 units of wood and 3 units of fiber from the collected ropes. Kalen placed his palm on the pile of debris and mentally commanded it to build. He expected a miracle accompanied by thunder and lightning. What happened was quieter and stranger. The wood beneath his hand flowed like wax. The planks fitted together on their own. The fibers of the ropes wove into the grooves and pulled them tight. The rotten sections crumbled into gray dust, and the dust seeped into the fresh seams. After 20 heartbeats, Kalen stood on a new raft twice as wide as the old one, with a knee-high rail and a gutter for rainwater. He dropped to his knees and ran his fingers along the seams. The wood had fused together as if it had grown as a single piece. He didn't know why the system had chosen him. He knew only one thing. This was his only chance not to die in this water. It rained that night, and the gutter collected 2 handfuls of fresh water for him. Kalen drank in small sips and looked at the blueprints that unfolded before him, one after another. A Scythian ship with a sail. Requires 20 units of wood, 8 units of fiber, and 2 units of metal. A harpoon. Requires 1 unit of wood, 1 unit of metal, and 1 unit of bone. The system also showed what he couldn't build yet, and that made him want to live even more. In the morning, the shark decided it had waited long enough. It struck the center of the raft from below, and Kalen fell against the side and heard a crack. A second blow knocked a plank out of the gutter. Kalen didn't wait for a third strike. He yanked the fragment of a knife from its mountings and tied it to the longest pole with the remaining rope. The counter flashed and suggested upgrading the makeshift weapon. There was exactly enough metal for 1 unit from the bracket found yesterday. There was no bone. The system accepted the substitution. It took 3 units of wood beyond the quota, and the pole in his hand solidified. Its sharpened end was encased in a metal ferrule. Kalen met the shark's third strike while standing. He drove the harpoon into its gray back, right behind the fin. The shark lurched and nearly dragged him overboard. He braced his heels against the gunwale and held on. His palms were on fire. The rope cut into his fingers until they bled. The shark dragged the raft in circles for half the morning, and by noon surfaced belly up. Kalen hauled the carcass halfway onto the raft and sat beside it for a long time, breathing heavily. Then he ate the raw meat and tasted nothing. The counter displayed a new entry. Bone, 7 units. Fat, 4 units. Skin, 2 units. The system processed the catch just as readily as it did debris. By evening on the 3rd day, Kalen had gathered everything he needed for the skiff from the drifting debris and the shark's remains. He gutted the old raft down to the last splinter, and a narrow hull with a slanted sail, sewn together by the system from canvas and sharkskin, rose from the water. The skiff responded to the rudder. The skiff cut through the waves. Kalen stood by the mast, and for the first time in all these days, his hands did not tremble. The question remained, where to go? The answer came on the 4th day in the form of a dead man. The body, clad in an officer's doublet, bobbed face down on the waves, and Kalen steered the skiff closer. In the dead man's bag, they found a brass compass and a piece of map covered in wax. Marked on the map was a cluster of crosses 2 days' journey to the northwest, along with a caption written in a hurried hand, "The Cemetery of 1,000 Masts." Kalen had heard of such places from the bosun, a shoal where currents had been washing up shipwrecks for hundreds of years, a place where there were more wreckage than water. For any sailor, it was a cursed place. For a shipyard carrier, it was a city-sized stockpile of building materials. Kalen set a course by compass. For 2 days he sailed under sail, eating shark meat and collecting every plank along the way. Wood, 31 units. Fiber, 12. Metal, 5. Bone, 9. The numbers grew, and with them grew a strange feeling in his chest. Not hope, something more solid. As the 2nd day drew to a close, the horizon ahead bristled. At first, Kalen mistook it for a dead forest. Then he realized. Masts. Hundreds of slanted masts jutted out of the water as far as the eye could see. Between them, the hulls of ships of all sizes loomed. Galleons with their superstructures torn away, fishing boats embedded in the hulls of military frigates, whalebones intertwined with anchor chains. The cemetery of 1,000 masts was real. Kalen lowered the sail and rowed his way through the wrecks. The water here was still and dark. The wood creaked. Scraps of foreign sails flapped in the wind. The shipyard counter went haywire, displaying thousands upon thousands of resource units all around. And then Kalen saw a light. Behind the keel of an overturned galleon, bonfires flickered. He rowed the skiff closer and took shelter in the shadow of the listing hull. On a wide platform made of connected decks, 3 bonfires burned, and people were moving about. 12 figures in rags and leather breastplates were tearing apart the fresh wreckage with crowbars. Scavengers. Cemetery scavengers. By the farthest bonfire stood a cage made of bent twigs, and something was moving inside it. Kalen squinted. A woman was sitting inside the cage. Moonlight fell on her, and Kalen saw that the woman had no legs below the waist. Below the waist, a fishtail shimmered silver. The mermaid looked through the bars straight into the darkness where his Scythian was hiding, and Kalen could have sworn she could see him. The mermaid looked at Kalen for exactly 3 heartbeats and then turned away. She didn't give him away. She turned toward the bonfires, and Kalen realized that if the scavengers found his skiff before dawn, they would take both the skiff and his life. He rowed the boat deeper into the labyrinth of shipwrecks and tied it up in the hold of a wrecked galleon. He didn't sleep all night. He lay on the listing deck and listened to the camp. The scavengers were drinking, swearing, and dividing up the day's haul. Their foreman was named Dreg. That name was shouted more often than any other. Dreg spoke louder than anyone else, and his voice sounded like the grinding of an anchor chain. From snippets of conversation, Kalen pieced together a picture. The scavengers lived in the graveyard permanently. Once a month, a collector from Baron Gvardo would come and take half the haul as payment for the right to rummage through the wrecks. Baron Gvardo controlled 20 islands to the north and a fleet of 30 pennants. The scavengers had caught the mermaid in a net 4 days ago, and Dreg was planning to sell her to the collector. A live mermaid was worth as much as 3 shiploads of copper. That morning, Kalen made a decision he couldn't even explain to himself. He made his way out to the camp in the open. He rowed his skiff straight to the platform, keeping his empty palms in plain sight. The scavengers poured out to the edge with crowbars and grappling hooks. Dreg turned out to be a burly old man with sun-scorched skin and 1 eye. His other eye was covered by a plate made of shark bone. Dreg asked who he was and why he shouldn't be drowned right then and there. Kalen replied that he was a shipwright and that, in exchange for food and water, he would repair any boat in the camp in a single night. The camp burst into laughter. Dreg laughed the longest. He said that this skinny drowned man couldn't even plane a paddle and that shipwrights don't sail into a graveyard alone in a homemade tub. But then Dreg narrowed his 1 eye and pointed his grappling hook toward the far end of the platform. There lay a velbot with a hole in its bottom. The hole was 2 palms wide and as long as a man is tall. Dreg said he'd give the drowned man 1 night. If by dawn the velbot was still afloat, the drowned man would get food and a place by the fire. If not, he'd get a stone tied around his neck. The camp roared with laughter again. Kalen nodded silently and asked for only one thing, that no one approach him during the night or interfere with the master's work. Dreg grunted and agreed. The master's quirks amused him. That night, Kalen dragged planks from the nearest wreck to the velbot and placed his palms over the breach. The shipyard took 12 units of wood and 4 strands. The wood melted together and fused, and by midnight the velbot's bottom was whole, without a single seam. For the remaining half of the night, Kalen didn't repair. He built. He selected a blueprint for a single-masted sloop from the list and ran his tally through the nearby wrecks. 40 units of wood from a wrecked schooner, 18 strands from rotted rigging, 7 pieces of metal from bent staples and a single anchor, 6 pieces of bone from a whale's rib. The shipyard worked in silence. The debris flowed toward the water behind the galleon and gathered into the hull like a school of fish gathering in a shoal. In the pre-dawn gloom, a sloop 14 paces long stood on the water, with smooth sides and a mast made from a single whale rib sheathed in wood. Kalen silently named it the Firstborn. At dawn, Dreg came to drown the drowned man. He saw the entire velbot and stopped. He ran his fingers along the bottom and found no seam. His single eye narrowed. Then Kalen brought the Firstborn out from behind the galleon, and Dreg's eye widened so much that the leather strap on his breastplate would have snapped had it been tightened. The foreman had been dismantling dead ships for 40 years. He knew every hull in this graveyard. He knew that this sloop hadn't been here yesterday, and that even 10 master builders couldn't have assembled a hull like this overnight. Dreg slowly walked around the sloop along the edge of the platform. He felt the sides. He tugged at the shrouds. Then he turned to Kalen, and his voice was quiet for the first time ever. He asked what Kalen wanted in exchange for building something like this for the camp. Kalen replied that he wanted 3 things: food and water for a month, the right to take any wreckage from the graveyard, and the mermaid from the cage. At that last word, the camp buzzed with excitement. The mermaid was worth more than their entire annual catch. Dreg haggled until noon. Kalen stood his ground and added a second sloop for the camp to the price. Greed battled fear of the Baron's collector within the camp leader, and greed won out. They shook hands. For 2 days, Kalen built the promised sloop for the camp and loaded the firstborn with supplies. The mermaid was carried aboard the firstborn right in her cage. She remained silent the whole time. She spoke only when the firstborn had moved a mile away from the platform and Kalen had broken the lock on the cage and flung the door open. The mermaid did not rush into the water. She remained seated, studying him with eyes the color of deep water. She asked why he had paid the price of an entire ship for her. Kalen shrugged and replied that he had seen her turn away that night and not give him away. A debt is a debt. The mermaid was silent for a long time. Then she said her name was Neris and that she had been the commander of the Deep One's border guard until a storm had washed her, wounded, onto the shallows. She said that the Deep Ones do not forgive debts and do not leave them unpaid. She rolled over the side and vanished into the dark water, and Kalen decided he would never see her again. He was wrong. An hour later, she surfaced at the ship's side and placed a bar of sea silver and a pearl the size of an eye on the deck. She said she knew every shoal and every current within 100 miles, and that his ship was blind without eyes underwater. She offered her services. Not out of duty, out of curiosity. In her entire life, she had never seen a man build ships the way coral builds a reef. Kalen held out his hand, and Neris gripped his wrist with her cold palm, as is the custom of the depths. And so the fleet, consisting of a single sloop, gained its first officer. The following week, they worked as a single team. By day, Kalen dismantled hulls at the far edge of the graveyard, and the shipyard's counters overflowed with numbers. The timber count had surpassed 400. Metal was over 60. Neris brought up from the seabed what no one on the surface had seen: bronze cannon barrels, ingots, bones of deep-sea creatures for which the shipyard assigned a special resource labeled spinal bone. This resource unlocked a new blueprint, a reinforced hull capable of withstanding a ram. By the end of the week, a 2-masted brigantine with plating reinforced with spinal bone stood next to the firstborn. Kalen named it Salty Dawn. And then a sail appeared from the north, and Neris was the first to spot it from the water. A lone tender flying a gray flag with a black wheel. Baron Gavardo's flag. The collector had arrived at the graveyard ahead of schedule. Kalen watched from his hiding place as the tender moored at the scavenger's platform and as Dreg bowed to the man in the iron breastplate. The conversation on the platform was heated. The wind carried snatches of it. The collector was shouting about 2 new ships that hadn't been there a month ago. He was shouting that an unauthorized shipyard on the Baron's lands deserved the noose. Dreg replied something, spreading his arms and pointing south. Kalen lowered the spyglass he'd found in the wreck. He understood everything. The foreman was buying his life with someone else's name. By evening, the tender weighed anchor and headed north at full speed. Neris surfaced alongside the Salty Dawn and said she'd overheard a conversation among the mooring crew underwater. The messenger was bringing the Baron news of a rogue master craftsman who built ships out of scrap in a single night. Vardo was rounding up people. They paid gold for such news, and the craftsmen themselves were brought to the Baron in chains. Kalen stood at the helm and looked north. A week ago, he had nothing but a raft made of 4 planks. Now he had 2 ships, a first mate, and his first enemy, a fleet of 30 pennants. Neris asked where they were going. Kalen unfolded the dead man's map and pointed to the only settlement marked east of the graveyard, a stilt village on the reefs called Tarnak. People need somewhere to replenish their fresh water, and he needs a place the Baron doesn't consider his own. Not yet, anyway. It was a 2-day journey to Tarnak, and by the end of the first day, Neris surfaced with bad news. She said the water ahead smelled of smoke and blood. She said she'd heard the distant creaking of many oars moving in unison. Kalen ordered them to lower the extra sails and proceed quietly. By nightfall, they saw a glow. Tarnak was on fire. The village stood on stilts above a reef shoal and consisted of about 50 huts connected by footbridges. Now a third of the huts were ablaze, and in the glow of the flames, 3 low-sided galleys with latticed holds were darting about. Slave traders. Neris recognized their outlines and said they were Skell's hunters. Skell ran the slave trade under the Baron of Vardo's authority and paid him a share for every head. The galleys were already pulling away from the village with full holds, and a 4th vessel was bringing up the rear, a narrow patrol lugger with a ballista at the bow. Kalen did the math quickly. 3 galleys with full holds meant 150 fighters against him and Neris. A head-on battle meant certain death. But the galleys, laden with booty, sat low in the water and moved slowly, and they still had to pass through the Needle Strait between the reefs. Neris knew the strait like the back of her hand. Kalen asked her how narrow the channel was there. Neris replied that 2 ship hulls could barely fit side by side. Kalen smiled for the first time that day, and it was a sinister smile. The shipyard had been working non-stop all night. Kalen had dismantled half of the Salt Dawn's deckhouse and used up the entire supply of spare timber to build something that wasn't on the blueprints. He'd assembled it himself from simple parts. A raft. Another raft. 8 rafts loaded with shark blubber, tow, and resin-soaked debris from the resource. Fire ships. Neris dived ahead and led the caravan of death through the darkness. By dawn, they had outflanked the sluggish galleys on the outer arc and entered the Needle Strait. Kalen stretched the rafts in a chain across the fairway, securing them to anchor stones just below the water's surface. He hid the lead raft behind the northern reef. He himself took his place on the Salt Dawn in the middle of the strait, in plain sight. The decoy had to be conspicuous. The galleys entered the strait around noon. From the lead ship, they shouted at Kalen to get out of the way, but he did not move. A lugger equipped with a ballista moved forward and fired a test shot. The stone projectile landed 20 paces from the ship's side. Kalen waited. Underwater, Neris waited for his signal by the outermost raft. When all 4 ships were between the reefs, Kalen lowered his hand. Neris tore the oil cap off the smoldering wick of the first fire ship. The fire spread in a chain reaction. 8 rafts burst into flames one after another, and the current carried them straight toward the line of galleys. In the narrow strait, there was nowhere to go. The lead galley took 2 fire ships in the side, and the fire leapt up the oiled wood to the oar ports. The second tried to turn away and ran aground on the reef. The third began to rock violently and crashed stern first into a lugger. The strait turned into a cauldron of fire, screams, and snapping oars. Kalen steered the Salty Dawn forward. The brigantine's bow, reinforced with a keelbone, struck the lugger's side and smashed through the hull like an eggshell. The ballista never fired a second shot. What followed was a terrible and filthy struggle. Skell's hunters knew how to enslave people, but they did not know how to fight on burning decks against a man with nothing to lose and a mermaid striking from beneath the water. By sunset, it was all over. 1 galley had burned down to the waterline. Kalen took the lugger, which had run aground on a reef, was speared by Kalen along with the crew, who surrendered without a fight. 150 Tarnak prisoners emerged from the barred holds into the light. The shipyard began dismantling the surviving galley and the wrecked lugger right on the spot, and the metal counters exceeded 100 for the first time. Skella was not among the dead or the prisoners. Neris said that the hunter had not been traveling with this caravan. Kalin remembered the name. They returned to Tarnak as heroes, but they were met not with celebration, but with ashes and distrust. The village was ruled by the elder Harem, a gaunt old man with a fisherman's hands and the eyes of a man who had survived 4 raids. Harem thanked them for the survivors dryly and briefly. Then, in front of everyone, he said that the stranger with his 2 ships would bring a 5th raid upon Tarnak, one more terrible than the previous ones. That the Baron would not forgive the sunken galleys. That the village would be better off ransoming Kalin's own head before it was too late. Half the village murmured in agreement. Kalin didn't argue. He asked the council for 10 days. If he couldn't make Tarnak impregnable within 10 days, he would leave on his own and take the ships with him. Harem smirked and asked if the stranger was planning to lift the village up to the heavens. But he granted the 10 days. Those rescued from the holds voted for it the loudest of all. From then on, time passed in segments, like ripples spreading across water. Cut 1. Kalin and the shipyard erect a palisade around the reef shoal made of sharpened whale ribs and fragments of masts driven into the seabed, so that any hull, except for a flat-bottomed vessel, would rip open its bottom upon approach. Neris marks out the only safe passage, and this passage curves 3 times. Cut 2. From the remains of galleys, the shipyard's first real structure on site takes shape. A floating dock with a retractable breakwater and 2 ballistas removed from a lugger and repaired to a condition better than new. Tarnak's children spend entire days hauling debris from all over the reef to Kalin, and the count keeps rising even without his involvement. Cut 3. Kalin is teaching 24 young fishermen how to man the ballistae and handle the boarding chain. He teaches them just as he was taught on the Wanderer, until they're drenched in sweat and their palms are raw. Cut 4. The Salty Dawn receives a second layer of plating and a ram made from a single piece of spinal bone, and a 3rd ship is launched alongside her. A fast, 2-masted hunter with gaff sails, built for pursuit and reconnaissance. Kalin gives it to Neris and names it the Swift. On the 9th day, Harem came to the dock alone, without witnesses. The old man walked along the palisade for a long time, feeling the beams that had fused together without seams, and watching as the young fishermen worked in unison to set up the ballista. Then he stopped in front of Kalin, his face moving as if the old man had forgotten how to use it. He said that for years he had believed that only stealth could save the village, that he had been wrong, and this was the 2nd time in his life he had said so aloud. He removed the village elder's bone staff from his belt and declared that, in matters of war, Tarnak would henceforth heed Kalin. Thus Kalin acquired his first harbor. And on the 11th day, the price for the victory in the strait was paid. The Swift returned from patrol at dawn with a torn sail. Neris climbed onto the dock, and water dripped from her along with blood from her lacerated shoulder. She said that during the night, a lone ship, the likes of which she had never seen, had caught up with them at sea. A black hull without a single lantern. It was faster than the Swallow under full sail. They only managed to escape by navigating through the reef's shallows. And then she said the most important thing. On the black ship's mainmast, it wasn't the Baron's flag that flew. Instead, there hung a human skeleton bleached white by salt, and beneath it, a banner bearing a red compass rose. When Harem heard this, he sat down right where he was standing. He said that only one ship in these waters flies the red compass rose. The freewheeling Captain Morvina, the one who'll take any price for any head. If Morvina is prowling near Tarnak, it means Baron Gvardo has offered such a reward for the master shipbuilder that the ocean's finest cutthroats have flocked to it. Kalin stood in the dock and watched the sunrise, and the sunrise was red. For 10 days he had been building a wall against the galleys and raids, but a wall would be of no use against a single swift black ship with a huntress on board. Morvina would not storm the palisade. Morvina would come for him personally. Morvina didn't keep him waiting. She came the very next night. She didn't try to break through the palisade, nor did she burn the village. She did something worse. At dawn, the lookouts found a black knife stuck in a whale rib on the outer reef with a tarred bundle beneath it. Inside the bundle lay a letter and a strand of gray hair. The letter was short. Morvina wrote that she had intercepted the village elder Corm's boat at the crossing, along with his granddaughter, who was carrying salt from the southern shoal. She wrote that the girl was alive and well and would remain so for 3 days. That in 3 days, at sunset, the master shipwright must go out alone, unarmed, to the flat rock at Broken Fang, 5 miles to the south. The master's head in exchange for the girl. A fair trade. Harem read the letter, and the old man's hands did not tremble only because he was clutching the edge of the table. The village was silent. Everyone understood the stakes. Neris, her shoulder bandaged, said she would follow underwater and slaughter the entire crew. Kaelin asked if she would make it before the huntress's knife touched the girl's throat. Neris didn't answer. Kaelin thought about it all day and half the night. He wasn't thinking like a warrior. He wasn't. He thought like a craftsman who knows that any object can be taken apart and put back together differently. Morvina sold death for money. That meant he could negotiate a price with her. He just had to make her listen for longer than a single stab of the knife. On the 3rd day at sunset, Kaelin stepped out onto the flat rock at Broken Fang, alone and unarmed, as he had been ordered. The black ship lay at anchor off the rock, and up close it was even more terrifying. Its narrow, predatory hull had contours unlike anything built by human hands. Morvina arrived in a rowboat with 6 fighters and a girl. The captain turned out to be a tall woman with skin darkened by all the latitudes of the ocean and hair bleached to the color of old copper. She moved like a barracuda, without a single superfluous movement. She placed the girl on a rock between herself and Kaelin and said she respected people who came to their deaths on time. Kaelin replied that he hadn't come to die, but to haggle over the price. Morvina laughed, and her laughter was cold. She said that the Baron was offering 800 gold rings for his head and that no one needed him alive. Kaelin nodded and did what he had come to do. He asked her to look to the left. The salty dawn was emerging from Broken Fang, and behind Morvina, 200 paces away, a ship was rising straight out of the evening sea. That night, Kaelin and the shipyard had sunk a pre-assembled hull with ballast chambers made of whale skulls onto the shoal by the cliff, and now the chambers were being blown out with blubber, causing the hull to float to the surface. Water was running down the bone frames. In the twilight, a ship rose from the sea that hadn't been there an hour ago. 6 of Morvena's fighters backed away toward the skiff. Morvina herself did not move, but her eyes widened, and Kaelin saw what he wanted to see. Not fear. Astonishment. He said that 800 rings was the price of one of his heads, and then he asked how much a ship cost that no one could catch up to in the ocean, a ship built personally for her. Faster than her black predator, with a bone ram and a hull that fears no reefs. He would build such a ship in 10 days and give it to her, along with the girl she would return right now. Or she could kill him and get 800 rings all at once. Or she could gain a master craftsman as an ally who would repair and reinforce her ship for the rest of her life. Morvina was silent for a long time. Then she asked why he thought she wouldn't take both the ship and his head afterward. Kaelin shrugged and replied that then she'd never know what he'd build for her next. Greed and curiosity. Everyone who lives by the sea gets caught on these 2 hooks. Morvina bared her teeth, and the snarl slowly turned into a smirk. She pushed the girl forward and said she'd give the master his 10 days, and if she didn't like the ship, she'd take what was hers, with interest. For 10 days, Kaelin barely slept. Morvina rode into Tarnak like a mistress, walking the docks, surveying everything with greedy eyes, and interfering with her advice. As a skeptic, she was vicious and nitpicky. She poked her finger at every bulkhead and said the wood would crack at the very first wave, that sails of that cut wouldn't hold up, that the master would drown everyone. On the 5th day, she fell silent. On the 7th, she began to help without a word. On the 10th day, a ship unlike any other in these latitudes was launched. A narrow 3-masted hull reinforced with a keel bone running from the keel to the gunwale. A ram made from the fang of a deep-sea creature hunted by Neris. An oblique rig that allowed it to sail closer to the wind than any of the Baron's ships. Morvena sailed around it 3 times. Then she took the helm and steered it out into open water, racing it until dark. She returned with her face wet from the spray, and for the first time, Kaelin saw the huntress smile genuinely. She said the ship would be called the Widow's Needle, and that she was tearing up the Baron's contract, and the 800 rings of Gavardo could shove them under his breastplate. The hunter was tired of hunting for copper coins. She said she sensed the winds of change and wanted to stand on the side where things were being built, not the side where they paid for heads. So the fleet gained a 3rd pennant and a female captain who knew every port and all the Baron's dirty secrets. And a day later, the sea brought a 4th force. Neris spotted her first and rose from the depths alarmed. She said that a woman was walking along the seabed toward Tarnak, not swimming, walking along the seabed as if on a road, and the fish parted before her. The woman emerged from the surf at sunset, barefoot and gray-haired, though her face was young. Her sealskin clothing was not wet. The village recoiled from her, and Harem whispered words of protection. A sea witch. The woman called herself Ishma and spoke softly. Her quiet voice rang in their ears. She said she had read the bones of the currents, and the bones had told her that a new fleet was rising on the empty waters. She had come to see the man who sews dead wood into living ships. She looked at Kaelin for a long time, and her gaze was like a lead lot sinking into the depths. Then she spoke words that made the air by the fire grow cold. She said that Baron Gavardo is a minor trouble, that an armada is gathering in his harbor to the north, and that, too, is a minor trouble. The great trouble is that the depths beneath the keels have grown too quiet. It is so quiet when that which sleeps at the very bottom awakens. She said that the deep choir is singing again in the sunken cities, and that their song is awakening the sleeper. She needs a fleet and a master. The master needs her eyes, which can see the weather a week in advance, and her word, which can the storm. Kaelin asked the price. Ishma smiled for the first time and replied that the price was a place by his mast when the real wave comes. That night, Morvena confirmed the worst part of the news from the mainland. Her people in the northern ports had relayed the message. Gavardo is not preparing a punitive raid, but a full-scale campaign. 28 battle pennants and 2,000 fighters, with Skell at his side along with his hunters. The Baron has announced to all the islands that he will burn Tarnak to the ground and crucify the ship's sorcerer on his own mast. The armada is set to set sail in 20 days. Kaelin gathered everyone at the dock, Horma, Neris, Morven, Ishma, and the village elders. He spread out a map and said in a steady voice that there was nowhere to flee because they had 1,500 residents with them whom they couldn't evacuate. That meant they would have to meet the armada in 20 days and defeat it. 4 ships against 28. The silence was so thick you could hear the surf breathing beneath the pilings. And then Morvena burst out laughing and said she'd always dreamed of an unequal battle in her favor and asked where her place was in the formation. 20 days was too short for a miracle and too long for despair, and Kaelin forbade himself both. He divided the time into tasks, and the work proceeded in stages. Stage 1. The shipyard consumes everything. Kaelin is scooping out the cemetery of 1,000 masts by the caravan load. Morvena on Widow's Needle and Neris on the Swift lead rafts there and return loaded to the brim. Dreg and his scavengers, having abandoned the platform, are defecting to Kaelin en masse because, after the Baron left on his campaign, they were the first to get their heads chopped off for the foreman's big mouth. The shipyard's counters show numbers that make your head spin. 4,000 units of timber, 600 units of metal, 210 units of backbone. Second cut. The fleet is growing. In a week, 2 brigs with rams and 4 flat-bottomed gunboats, each carrying 2 ballistas, are launched. Ishma walks along the hulls under construction and whispers into the frames, and after her whisper, the wood no longer catches fire from simple pitch. Cut 3. Tarnak is becoming an army. 300 men and women from the village, along with yesterday's slaves from Skell's holds, are learning boarding tactics from Morvina and ballista shooting from the senior fishermen. At first it goes badly, then tolerably, then almost well. Cut 4. For 10 nights in a row, Ishma reads the bones of the currents, and on the 11th night, he tells Kalin the most important thing. On the day the armada approaches Tarnak from the northwest, a dead swell will come, followed by an ebb of unprecedented strength. A window half a day long when the reef fields around the village will be exposed an elbow's height higher than usual. Kalin listens, and on the map in his mind, the 28 foreign pennants transform from a death sentence into a problem with a solution. On the 15th day, something came that Kalin hadn't expected. A swift intercepted a lone skiff on patrol, heading toward Tarnak under a white rag. Inside the skiff sat a woman in a uniform tunic of the Baron's fleet with torn insignia. She introduced herself as Liren, and said she had been the first mate on the flagship Gavardo and had fled the fleet the night before last. When asked why she had fled, she laid 2 items on the table, a ship's log and a copper plaque bearing Skell's personal seal. She said that the Baron had awarded Skell the contract for all the captives of the upcoming campaign, including Tarnak's children, and that she had been transporting slave caravans, considering it part of her duty, until she saw the hold after a 2-week voyage. She would no longer carry them. Inside the logbook lay the Armada's expedition order, depth soundings, and the flagship's signal book. Morvina said it was too generous a gift and that a defector smelled like a trap. Horm said the same. Kalin wasn't looking at the logbook, but at Liren's hands. The navigator's hands, stained with ink and calloused from the sextant, trembled right up until the moment he asked her about the depth soundings off Wolf's Ridge. Then the trembling stopped, and within a quarter of an hour, Liren had analyzed Kalin's entire defense on the map and found 3 gaps in it that no one had thought of. With a mind like that, you either trust it completely or cut it off immediately. Kalin chose to believe her and said so aloud in front of everyone. Liren looked at him as if, for the first time in years, someone had restored her right to be herself. She remained a skeptic right up until the battle. She said she'd seen the Baron's fleet in action, that Kalin's gunboats wouldn't hold their ground, and that the country soldiers would flee after the first volley. She said all this while continuing to work 18 hours a day, reworking the defense plan. This is how the plan turned out. They would not meet the Armada at the palisade, where 28 pennants would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, but at Wolf Ridge, a long arc of reefs 8 miles to the north with 3 passages. Liren proposed leaving the western passage open and clearly visible, an invitation to a clever enemy who would assume the other 2 were mined. The Baron would take the western passage. At low tide, a time known only to Ishma, on the 20th day at dawn, the horizon to the north darkened with sails. From the mast, Liren counted 29 pennants. Gavardo brought 1 more than promised. The flagship sailed at the center of the formation, a 3-decked heavy galleon with an ironclad bow named the Iron Vow. Kalin led his fleet out to meet them, and his fleet was counted in a minute. The Salty Dawn, the Widow's Eagle, the Swift, 2 brigs, and 4 gunboats. 9 against 29. Morvina made the first move. The Widow's Eagle sailed single-handedly within firing range along the entire length of the enemy line and hoisted a bleached skeleton and a red compass rose on its mast. The provocation was precisely calculated. Behind the traitor's back, 6 of Skell's hunter ships broke ranks, and the Eagle led them eastward to where Neris awaited underwater with 50 harpoon-wielding divers from the people of the depths who had come at her call to avenge their commander. In the eastern passage, the 6 ships encountered chains stretched beneath the water, their hulls slashed open, and harpoons striking from beneath the surface. Not a single one returned to the main force. Gvardo, the flagship commander, did not succumb to the provocation and led the main force through the western passage just as had been planned for him. 23 pennants drew into the arc of the Wolf Ridge in a wide, confident formation across the open water. And then Ishma, standing at the bow of the Salty Dawn, raised her hands and spoke to the storm in a language that made the crew's blood run cold. And from the northwest came the dead swell promised by the bones, and in its wake the Kalin began to drift away. An ebb of unprecedented force scooped water from beneath the Armada's keels at a rate of a handful per minute. Liren knew from her own calculations where the water would run shallow first. Kalin's gunboats, with their flat bottoms, navigated the exposed shoals as if they were a courtyard. The Baron's heavy ships, one after another, scraped their bottoms against the seabed and ran aground on the rocks, and the formation turned into a chaotic mess. Then the onslaught began, one that Kalin would rather not recall but would remember forever. The gunboat's ballistas fired incendiary pots at the motionless hulls. The brigs rammed those still afloat. By noon, a third of the Armada was ablaze and a third was stranded on the reefs. But the Iron Vow was not called the heavy flagship for nothing. Gvardo cut down the masts, gathered 8 surviving ships around him, and led them on a breakthrough, not backward, but forward. Straight toward Tarnak, where only a palisade, a few old men, 2 dock ballistas, and Horm remained. Kalin saw this maneuver too late. His fleet was scattered across the entire arc of the ridge. Only the Salty Dawn managed to respond, and even then, only halfway. By the time the brigantine burst into the lagoon, the Iron Oath was already smashing through the palisade with its ironclad bow, and Skell's boarding parties were pouring from its sides. Horm stood by the dock ballista until the very end. The old man fired 2 precise shots into the cluster of boarders, but didn't have time to load a third. From the deck of the Dawn, Kalin saw Skell personally hack down the foreman at the oarlock. After that, Kalin's memory was hazy. He remembered how the Dawn, at full speed, rammed its bone ram into the side of the Iron Vow so hard that both decks bucked. He remembered the boarding and Morven appearing on the left with the needle, and Neris with her swimmers climbing onto the enemy's deck straight out of the water. He remembered finding Skell by the burning mainmast, and that afterward he had to pull the blade out of the deck with both hands. Baron Gavardo was taken alive in his own cabin, where he was trying to burn the treasury ledgers. By sunset, it was all over. Of the Armada's 29 pennants, 8 had sailed north without their flagship or the Baron. 11 had surrendered. The rest were burning on the reefs of the Wolf's Ridge, and the ebb tide had already begun to recede, the water hissing over the coals. Tarnak had paid for the victory with 47 lives, and the village elder, Horm, lay first on that list by the breach in the palisade, covered by a sail. Kalin stood over him in silence, and the village stood silent behind him. Horm's granddaughter approached and placed the elder's bone staff in Kalin's palm, saying that her grandfather had ordered her to pass this on if he could not do so himself. That night, everyone gathered on the dock amid the ashes, the crews of the 9 ships, the swimmers of Neris, the villagers, the prisoners, and the scavengers of Draga. Liren stepped forward and declared before everyone that she had been wrong twice, once when she served the Baron, and once when she did not believe the village fleet could hold its formation. Morvenna raised her mug and bellowed that 9 ships were no longer a fleet of loners, but a flotilla, and that a flotilla needed a commander. The words caught on, rolled through the crowd, and turned into a roar. Kalin raised his hand, and the roar subsided. He said he accepted the challenge and that this was only the beginning, because the ocean was vast and there were more barons on it than just Gavardo. He was still speaking when he saw Ishma's face and fell silent. The witch stood at the water's edge with her back to everyone, gazing out at the black night sea. Kaelin walked over and stood beside her. The water in the lagoon was as still as oil, too still for the night after a storm. Ishma said, without turning around, that during the battle she had spoken to the storm, and her voice had gone deeper than it should have. Down below, they had heard her. She said that the deep choir had stopped singing that night, and the choir falls silent in only one instance, when the sleeper opens his first eye and begins to listen for himself. The sleeper was listening, and the first proof of this was the silence that killed. 3 days after the battle, the fishermen of Tarnak returned with empty nets and said that the fish had vanished from the waters around the village, every last fry. Another day later, Neri rose from the depths, pale, and said that her divers were afraid to go deeper than 20 fathoms because there were no sounds down there anymore. No clicking of shrimp, no songs of whales, no creaking of currents against the rocks. The depths lay silent as a flooded crypt. And for the people of the depths, a silent abyss is more terrifying than any storm. Kaelin listened and realized that this new trouble was unlike any before. The Baron could be defeated. The Huntress could be bribed. But with whatever was silencing the ocean, neither was possible until he knew what it was. Ishma said that the answers lay in 2 places, in the memory of the people of the depths and in the flooded cities where the core sang. Neris sent the 2 fastest swimmers to their kin in the cold waters to retrieve the elders' memories. Meanwhile, the fleet was consumed by the burdens of victory, and those burdens proved heavier than war itself. 11 surrendered ships required crews that were not available. 400 prisoners demanded food and a decision on their fate. The 20 islands left without a baron demanded authority, and within a week, boats carrying island elders set out for Tarnak. They bowed and begged for protection, lied, and tested the new master. Kaelin decided as follows. He announced to the prisoners that there would be no chains. Whoever wanted to leave would receive a rowboat and water. Whoever stayed would receive work, a share of the profits, and, after a year, a clear name. Fewer than 100 left. To the island chieftains, he announced a tax half that of the barons, but firm, and said that in return he would provide 3 things: protection from any hunters, trials without bribes, and shipyards that would repair their boats for free. Liren kept all the accounts, and a month later she told Kaelin, with the same skeptical twitch at the corner of her mouth, that his generosity would bankrupt the treasury in half a year. Another month later, she came to him with different figures, and the skeptical crease had vanished. The islands that had been given breathing room began trading 3 times as vigorously, and the small, fixed tax brought in more than the baron's plunder. Liren said that in her 20 years of service, this was the first time she'd seen the treasury grow as a result of mercy. The fleet was growing too. The shipyard processed the wrecked hulls of the Armada, and Kaelin found an entry in the construction list that changed everything. A floating shipyard. A massive platform with a dock in the center, capable of building ships without his constant presence, provided it was loaded with resources and blueprints. He stationed it in the Tarnak Lagoon and named it the Anvil. Now the fleet was building itself. By the end of the 2nd month, Kaelin had 26 pennants at his disposal, and Morven worked her crew to the bone and said that in a year's time, this motley crew would become a fleet worth dying for. And then the swimmers of Neris returned from the cold waters, and with them came an old man of her people. Elder Thal was as white as foam, and his tail had lost half its scales to old age. They carried him into the dock in a tub of seawater, and he spoke slowly, each word costing him great effort. He said that the sleeper is neither a beast nor a god. It is what remains of the one who split the moon. 300 years ago, the world did not drown of its own accord. There was a war among the ancient powers, and the last of them, falling from the sky, lay down on the seabed and fell asleep, her slumber sustained by the songs of the deep choir. The choir are not monsters. The choir are guardians. The flooded cities are full of machines from the old world that sang a lulling song, and the guardians have spent centuries repairing them and keeping the song unbroken. If the choir falls silent, it means the machines have begun to die, one after another. The sleeper will awaken slowly, a year or 2 or 3. First, the fish will disappear. Then the dead volcanoes will begin to breathe again. Then the waves will forget their rhythm, and the tides will go mad. And when he opens his second eye, the ocean will rear up and sweep away everything that floats and everything that protrudes above the water. Tal finished speaking, and silence fell over the dock, almost as dead as the depths below. Morvena was the first to break it, asking if it was possible to kill the sleeper. Tal replied that the elders did not know, but they know where to find the answer. In the greatest of the sunken cities, in Ern beneath the waves, the capital of the sunken world, where the heart of Hor lies and the archives of the ancient powers are kept. No one has gone down there for 300 years because the city lies at a depth where neither human nor mermaid can dive, and its approaches are guarded by the last sentinels, who have gone mad from their long silence and attack anything that moves. Kalen asked how deep it was. Tal said 400 fathoms. Liren voiced what everyone was thinking. Nothing made of wood could descend 400 fathoms. The pressure would crush any hull like an egg. Everyone looked at Kalen, and Kalen was already mentally leafing through the shipyard's blueprints. Among the designs unlocked after processing the bones of deep-sea creatures was a branch he had so far avoided: submersible hulls. The first blueprint in the branch was called the Bell and required a resource he didn't have: armored bone. The shipyard offered a clue. Armor bone is carried by the bottom-dwelling giants, the abyssal hermit crabs that live near the vents of underwater volcanoes. Ishma listened and said she knew of such a place: the Vent Fields, a 6-day journey to the east, beyond the boundaries of all maps. A place her teachers called the Forge of the Deep. Thus was born the fleet's first long-range expedition. Kalen took the Salty Dawn, the Widow's Needle, the Swift, and the new heavy brig, the Hammer, along with 120 of his finest fighters. He left the Tarnak and the Anvil with Liren and Dreg, along with half the fleet. Morvena led the main body. Neris sailed underwater on patrol. Ishma stood at the bow and listened to the water. 6 days of the journey passed in slices. The first slice. On the 3rd day, the fleet passed over the flooded town, and everyone looked over the side. In the clear water, 40 fathoms below, lay the streets and squares and the bell tower, and the bell still hung in the bell tower. Ishma said that before the moon split, 30,000 people had lived here. No one on deck uttered a word until sunset. Cut 2. On the 4th day, the sea around us became as warm as soup and as lifeless as death. No birds, no fish, only a yellow murk with sulfuric streaks in the water. Cut 3. On the 5th day, at night, everyone woke up to a rumbling. Far to the east, a crimson glow hung over the horizon, and the water quivered with a faint tremor. The dormant volcano was breathing. Tala's first prophecy was coming true before their eyes. On the 6th day, they reached the Forge of the Depths. The place looked like a field of steaming cauldrons. Pillars of steam rose from the water for a mile in every direction, and the smell of sulfur was so strong it brought tears to their eyes. Neris went to scout the area and returned quickly. She said the crabs were there. A dozen giants were grazing in the vent fields at a depth of 30 fathoms, each the size of a gunboat. The armor on any one of them would be enough for 3 bells. But there was a problem worse than the crabs. On the sea floor between the vents, she had seen fresh tracks. Strips of scraped-away sediment as wide as a ship. Something enormous had crawled through here recently, and the tracks led to the largest vent. Kaelin decided not to court trouble and to take the nearest crab quickly. The plan was simple. The hammer would tow a bundle of barrels filled with shark fat and rotten fish as bait. The crab would be drawn by the scent into the shallows. The ballistae of all the ships would fire harpoons with ropes into the seams of its carapace. Then the entire fleet would pull together until the giant went down. The first half of the plan went off without a hitch. The crab was drawn by the scent. It turned out to be even larger than Neris had said, and its shell was encrusted with coral like a reef. 8 harpoons struck the seams. The fleet pulled on the ropes, and then the seabed groaned. From the main vent half a mile away, a gas bubble the size of an island rose, the water boiled, and a head emerged from the churning water. Not a crab, a serpent. A sea serpent as thick as the hammer's hull and 1/4 of a mile long, with skin of fused volcanic glass. A creature that even Tal did not name, for there were no names left for it. The serpent looked at the ships with eyes the color of lava, and Ishma screamed that it was not a beast but a guardian. Hor's frenzied guardian slid from his post, and at her scream, the serpent lurched toward the fleet. What followed was not a battle, but a retreat fought while fleeing. They did not cut the ropes. Morvena bellowed out a decision, mad, yet the only correct one. The crab tore away from the serpent toward the north, and the fleet followed the crab on the ropes as if in tow, using the giant's panic as a sail. The serpent followed close behind, and the water burned in its wake. Ballistas fired into its maw, and pots of fire shattered against its glassy hide without a trace. The Swift fell half a hull length behind, and the serpent's tail smashed its stern to splinters. Underwater, Neris managed to pull 2 people from the sinking stern, but was too late for the third. Ishma saved them all, and her strength ebbed away. The witch stood at the stern of the Zarya and began to sing, not a storm song, but another, low and drawn out, like the depths themselves. The lullaby of Korra, which she had learned from her teachers. The serpent lost its bearings. It spun. The song called him back to the sleep he'd been deprived of, and the creature was torn between rage and 300 years of exhaustion. That was enough for the squadron, with the crab in tow, to break free from the choke points into the cold water, where the serpent did not follow. Ishma finished singing, collapsed, and did not regain consciousness until evening. The crab at sunset near a nameless shoal. The shipyard dismantled the carcass all night, and the counter read 140 carapace bones. Kaelin stared at the number without a trace of joy. The Swift was dead. The young ballister Yarvi remained in the maelstrom fields forever. Ishma lay there, now completely gray, without a single dark strand of hair. And in the darkness behind the stern, at the very limit of audibility, the ocean sighed once, deeply and long, like a sleeper who had rolled over onto the other side. There was enough armor bone for 3 bells, but the shipyard immediately showed Kaelin a price he hadn't factored in. The bell's blueprint required, in addition to the bone, what was called the breath of the depths, compressed air from the old world, sealed in bronze vessels that had been made only before the moons split. Without the breath, the bell was simply a sturdy block of bronze. The breath counter stood at 0. Kaelin convened a council on the anvil, and Lirin laid out on the table everything she knew about the bronze vessels of the old world. The breath meter read 0. Kaelin convened a council at the anvil, and Lirin laid out on the table everything she knew about the old world's bronze vessels. She knew little, but what she knew was certain. Such vessels had been found in the holds of ships that sank in the early years of the flood, when people were still trying to salvage the possessions of the old cities. And one such ship was known to every sailor in these latitudes through legend, the caravan galleon Golden Sorrow, which carried the treasuries and furnishings of 3 cities and sank in the shallow waters of the Hanged Men, 100 miles to the south. The legend said that the Sorrow had been sought for 300 years, and no one had found it. Morvena smiled and said that the legend was half true. The sorrow had been found. 15 years ago, a free captain named Rada Blacktooth found it, and ever since then, the shallow waters of the Hanged has been his domain and his stronghold. Rada has been making a little for 15 years now, and trades in old bronze, and for that, all the barons of the south tolerate him. His fleet consists of a dozen pennants, but it's not about the fleet. The shallow is a labyrinth of 1,000 sandbars that shift with every storm, and without Rada as a pilot, no one enters there. Whoever enters without permission is found hanged from his own yardarm. That's where the place gets its name. Kalen asked what Rada loved most of all. Morvena answered without hesitation, gold and spectacles. Blacktooth maintains an arena on his main sandbar where fighters battle for money, and he himself never misses a single fight. The plan took shape from that answer. Go with a small force. Don't fight, trade instead, and offer Rada something he doesn't have. And if the deal fell through, Kalen had another option he'd learned from Verfi. A week before setting out, he'd built a small, unmanned submersible hull from scraps of armored bone and spines, an underwater messenger 3 paces long that resembled a bony fish. The messenger could do one thing: travel in a straight line underwater wherever it was directed and drag a rope behind it. Neris looked at the bonefish and said that with such a thing, they could enter places where the gates wouldn't let them in. They set out for shallow waters on 2 ships, the Salty Dawn and the Widow's Needle. Morvena said that approaching Rada with a large fleet was like approaching a loan shark with an army. They wouldn't open the gate. On the 3rd day of their journey, they were met by Rada's patrol tenders, which led them through a labyrinth of sandbars. Liren stood at the rail, trying to memorize the turns, and after an hour, she admitted honestly that it was impossible to remember. The sandbars jutted out of the water like ribs, with channels winding between them, and on every other headland stood a gallows with the birds' spoils hanging from it. Rada's fortress sat on the largest sandbar, a palisade of masts, batteries of cannons salvaged from sunken ships, and an arena in the center. A circle of ships' frames driven into the ground, over which hung the roar of the crowd. Rada Blacktooth received them in the arena during a break between fights. He turned out to be a huge old man with skin like saddle leather and a single black tooth in a white smile. He listened to Kalen's name and said he'd heard of him, the ship's sorcerer who had devoured Baron Gavardo. Rada said he respected an appetite, but wouldn't sell out his own. Bronze from sorrow feeds his braids, and what use is a stranger's gold to him when he has 3 holds full of it himself? Kalen offered ships. Rada yawned. Kalen offered a shipyard that would repair his dozen pennants for free for 10 years. Rada picked at a black tooth and said that his prisoners repair his ships. Then the old man leaned forward, his eyes flashing with a spectacular hunger. He said there was one price. Tomorrow is a big day in the arena. The battle for the title of First Blade of Shallow Waters. And if the sorcerer's man can hold his own in this fight against Rada's fighter, then Rada will hand over 100 bronze vessels and passage through the sandbars as a bonus. But if he can't hold his own, then both beautiful ships will remain at the dock forever, along with their crews. Morvena began to stand up, and Kalen held her by the elbow. He asked who Rod's fighter was. The old man smiled, baring all his gums, and pointed toward the arena. There, by a pillar, sat a creature a head taller than a human, shoulders like a crab's, arms down to his knees, skin covered in gray, bony plaques. A half-breed of the deep races, the ones Neris called Deep Ones, about whom she said that a human pitted against a deep one in strength was like a child against a wave. The fighter's name was Molchun, and in 8 years he had not lost a single fight nor spoken a single word. Kalen agreed and named his fighter himself. The night before the fight was long. Morvena cursed so fiercely that birds flew up from the gallows. She said she would go out herself and chop the bottom-born into bait. Kalen replied that she was known as the finest blade in these parts, and Rad would simply pit 3 men against her. It would be laughable for the old man to pit a weak outsider against Molchun, and in his laughter he wouldn't notice the trick. Neris silently slipped into the night waters, towing a bone messenger. The plan had been 2-pronged from the very beginning. By morning, the arena was so packed that the bulkheads were creaking. Kalin stepped into the ring with a single short spear against Mulchun, who wielded a cutlass as long as an oar. For the first 3 exchanges, Kalin was simply surviving. He dove under the cutlass, rolled away, and got back up, while the crowd howled with delight and contempt. Mulchun moved with the economy of a machine, and on the 4th exchange, he struck him flat across the ribs. Kalin heard a crack, and the world went white. He got back up. In that was the calculation that no one but him understood. The shipyard didn't just repair ships. The night before the fight, Kalin had spent 30 units of spine bone on what the blueprint called a bone undershirt. An armored shirt worn under his clothes that fused with his body while he wore it. It didn't make him stronger. It allowed him not to break. And it also allowed him to take a blow that would have knocked anyone else out for good, to get back up, and to see the first expression on Mulchun's face in 8 years. Surprise. From then on, Kalin fought not against the dawn, but against his confidence. He got back up after every blow. He held on not by strength, but by what the crowd had begun to call stubbornness, while Rad, leaning forward from his chair, called it a spectacle. On the 12th exchange, Mulchun hesitated for half a breath for the first time in his life, not understanding what was before him. And in that half-breath, thunder struck from the sea. It wasn't a storm. It was Neris, who had sent a bone messenger at night, using a rope to slip beneath all the sandbars straight into the inner sanctum, the guarded lagoon where Rad held a pontoon crane directly above the Golden Sorrow itself. By morning, her swimmers had made their way there along the rope. And now, before the eyes of the entire arena, Radha's pontoon crane was slowly and majestically pulling away from the spit and heading out into the sea through the channel, carrying on its slings the last cargo lifted from the Sorrow. Radha roared, and the battle died down of its own accord. Kalin, standing in the middle of the arena, spat out blood and told the old man in the ensuing silence that the crane would return intact by evening. Or it might not. It depends on what we agree on. He said he hadn't intended to steal anything. He'd intended to show that Radha's labyrinth was no longer a wall, that the sorcerer had passed through the sandbars underwater at night and would do so again, and no gallows would stop him. And then he offered what he'd come for. Not a deal for 100 vessels. An alliance. Radha, with its labyrinth and pilots, joins the fleet. It keeps the sandbars, the arena, and its share of the bronze. In return, it receives protection from the southern barons who have been sharpening their teeth on the shallow for 20 years, as well as the shipyard and the truth about what is happening to the ocean. Kalin spoke of dead fish and breathing volcanoes, and of the sleeper, and the crowd in the arena fell silent, sandbar by sandbar. The people of the sea had already seen the omens for themselves. Radha stared at him for a long time, his single tooth protruding. Then he asked why the sorcerer hadn't taken the vessels by force if he could have. Kalin replied that an empire isn't built on theft. It's built so that everyone who enters it regrets only one thing, that they didn't enter sooner. Radha burst out laughing and laughed for a long time. Then he held out a palm the size of a shovel and said that for the first time in 15 years, someone had outwitted him at his own game, and that he trusted such a man more than he trusted a treaty. That evening, the crane returned to the lagoon. Mulchun came to the pier where the Zarya was moored, stood silently before Kalin, and held out his dagger to him, hilt first. Morvena interpreted the gesture. Dani is choosing a new master of the fight. For 8 years he had waited for the one who would rise after his blow. The flotilla set sail from Radha Fortress with 300 bronze breathing vessels, maps of the southern waters, and the pilot's oath. And at the exit from the labyrinth, news worse than any battle awaited them. A Radha patrol tender had brought a rescued fisherman from the south. The fisherman was alone in a boat meant for 8, and his eyes were white with terror. He reported that the island of Lotan, 2 days' sail to the south, was no longer an island. That night, the sea around Lotan rose like a mountain and then subsided, and when dawn broke, where the island with its 3,000 inhabitants had stood, there was only open water. Not a storm, not a wave from the horizon. The sea simply rose up in place as if something very large had turned over in its sleep beneath it. Ishma listened and said 3 words. The second eye opens. The 3,000 who perished on Lotan put an end to all disputes over deadlines, and Kalin announced at the anvil what he called the final launch. Everything the shipyard builds is now being built for one purpose, for the launch into the Urnapod, the waves. Liren did the math and said that with the anvil running at full capacity, the 3 bells would be ready in 40 days. Ishma calculated her own estimate based on the currents and said that they had 40 days but not 80. The entire life of the flotilla hinged on these 2 numbers. The work proceeded in stages. Phase 1. The anvil never stops, day or night. Armor bone and bronze fuse together into 3 spherical hulls, each 5 steps in diameter, with windows made of mountain crystal that Radha obtained from Scorby. Each bell is manned by 8 people and descends to depth on a bone screw driven by a system of counterweights. The vessels hold enough air for 6 hours underwater. Cut 2. Morvena selects and drives the cruise. The descents begin at 20 fathoms and go deeper every day. At 100 fathoms, one of the selected men turns gray and begins to scream inside the iron hull, so he is replaced. At 200 fathoms, the crystal window of the first bell cracks and the shipyard reinforces the hull. Cut 3. Neris assembles an escort fleet underwater. At her call, 3 dozen divers from the people of the depths arrive and bring tamed draft stingrays as wide as a sail. The stingrays will carry the bells the final third of the way to where the propellers will become too slow. Cut 4. Ishma and Thal reconstruct the map of Urna from memory. The capital lies in a pass between 2 mountain ranges. Guards stand watch at the entrance to the pass. The Heart of Hor stands in a temple on the central square, and the main street, which Thal calls the Road of Voices, led there. On the 38th day, the bells were ready and were given names. Kalin named the first one Horm. The second was named Yarvi after a fallen baluster. Ishma asked that the third be named the Cradle. Deciding on the composition of the descent team was difficult. Kalin went alone, and no one argued with this because only he could repair the shipyard's hulls at depth through touch. Accompanying him aboard Horm were Ishma, Mulchun, and 5 fighters. Morvena went aboard Yarvi with the boarding party of 7. Liren went aboard Cradle with the time and breath counters and a supply of bronze vessels. Neris led everyone from the outside with her swimmers and stingrays. Tarnak and the fleet remained on Rad, Dreg, and the senior ships. They set out at dawn, and the entire flotilla stood in the roadstead in silence. A single buoy bearing Tarnak's flag bobbed above the launch site in the open ocean. Further down. For the first 100 fathoms beyond the windows, the sky was still blue. At 200, darkness fell, along with a cold so biting that their breath froze into frost on the bronze. At 300, the bells handed the tow line over to the stingrays, and from there on, a living force pulled them through the darkness, where the light of the oil lamps illuminated only the snow formed from dead plankton. Liren counted the depth aloud by the tension of the lead cable, and her voice in the intercom was the only human sound in the entire ocean. At 360 fathoms below, a light appeared. Not a reflection of the lamps, its own glow. The Urna abyss opened up beneath them like a gaping wound filled with pale green fire. The ruins themselves were glowing. For 300 years, deep-sea fungi and polyps had inhabited the dead city, and now they outlined its entire expanse. Streets, palaces, bridges between the towers. The city was enormous. Tarnak could have fit inside a single square of it. Ishma stared into the crystal, tears streaming down her face, and she didn't notice. And then the guards arrived. Neris sounded the alarm by tapping the hull in a prearranged rhythm. Shadows rose from the ruins of the gate towers. 6 creatures resembling the serpents of the Forge of the Bottom, but smaller, thinner, and covered in sores. Mad, starving, mute sentinels. The skates darted off in all directions, leading the bells and the Clane met the guards with harpoons, and what followed was something Kalen could only watch through the crystal, clenching his useless fists. An underwater battle is a dance of shadows and flashes. The swimmers writhed around the creatures like small fish around sharks. 2 guards were lured into a false chase toward the ridges. One was entangled in a whale net, but the 4th broke through, and its tail lashed out at Yarvi. Morvena's bell somersaulted and landed on the dome of the ruined tower, and the lotus rope snapped. Morvena's curses came through the speaking tube, which meant they were alive. Ishma's voice saved them all once again. The witch pressed her lips to the speaking tube that had been lowered into the water and sang Hora's lullaby straight into the depths. And then something happened that no one had expected. They answered her. From the depths of the city, near the temple, a response came, faint and ragged like the breath of a dying man, but the same song. Hora's last living machine was still singing somewhere down there. And the guards heard it. The creatures froze in the depths. They turned around and slowly moved toward the sound of the dying song, like dogs responding to their master's voice, forgetting about the intruders. The path was clear. They lifted Yarvi from the broken tower. The hull was intact, but 2 ribs of the frame had burst, and Kalen spent 20 units of armor bone from the cradle's stockpile to repair them through touch. They continued along the road of voices. The street, as wide as an arrow's flight, led through the city, and on either side stood life-sized statues with their mouths agape. Thal had said that before the flood, the statues used to sing. Now, clusters of glowing polyps protruded from their mouths, and it seemed as though the city was screaming with light. The Temple of Horus stood in the central square and was intact, the only undamaged building in all of Irna. Its dome glowed from within, and that same broken song emanated from it. At the temple gates, the sleds came to a halt and refused to go any further, no matter what bait was offered. The bells lay at the bottom of the square, and from there they had to continue on foot. The shipyard's blueprint for such an eventuality had been prepared in advance: armored suits, bone armor with small breathing apparatus, each providing a quarter-hour's supply of air. 6 of them set out: Kalen, Ishma, Molchun, Morvena, and 2 of her fighters. It took 15 minutes to get there. The temple gates were ajar, exactly 1 person's width. Inside, the pressure seemed to recede. The dome held a 300-year-old air bubble. Water stood halfway up, and above that was air that was unbreathable, but in which light burned. They climbed the inner staircase above the water and removed their helmets at the very heart of Horus. The heart turned out to be a machine the size of a ship. A column of bronze and crystal rose into the dome, its entire surface covered in pipes like an organ. Of the 1,000 pipes, 3 were singing. The rest were silent, flooded with petrified salt. At the foot of the column lay the guardian sentinels. Not beasts, people of the old world in tattered clothes. The bones of those who, 300 years ago, had remained below to set the song in motion and never emerged. And in front of the column stood a music stand, and on the music stand lay a book bound in metal that the salt had not corroded. Ishma opened it, and the witch's hands trembled. She read the dead language slowly aloud, and the words fell into the silence of the temple like a lot into the depths. The book was the journal of Horus's last guardian, and it contained everything. That the sleeper is the battle-ready heart of the heavenly fortress that split the moon. That he cannot be killed because he is not alive. That he can only be put back to sleep. Horus's song is not music, but a precise harmony of sounds that lulls the heart into slumber. 3 things are needed for the song: a voice, that is, a machine or creature capable of sustaining a sequence of sounds of superhuman power; a score, that is, the sequence itself, recorded in this book on 12 pages; and a place. One must not sing from here. Erna's choir was merely a transmitter. One must sing above the sleeper himself, at a point the overseer called the Dome of the Abyss, whose coordinates were listed on the last sheet. Liren received the coordinates over the intercom, recalculated them, and her voice faltered. The Dome of the Abyss lay 9 days' journey to the east, beyond the edge of all maps, in waters that all the nautical charts of the last 3 centuries had designated with 2 words: the waters of wrath. Ishma finished reading the last page of the journal and fell silent for a long time. Then she said the rest. The keeper wrote that they could no longer build a machine of such power, but a pattern of sounds could sustain a living throat if it were ancient and immense. The keeper wrote the word whale, but not just any whale, the foremother of whales, the one whose song is heard across the entire ocean once every 100 years, if her lineage is still alive. Neris tapped on the hull from the outside, signaling that their breath was running out and it was time to ascend. Kaelin wrapped the book in oiled leather and took one last look at the 3 singing pipes. The song of Erna's heart surged and then faded. The machine had months left. The ascent was quiet, save for one moment. At 200 fathoms, when the blackness began to turn gray, all 3 bells shuddered at once. From below, from Erna's abyss, a sound came through the depths that had not been there on the way down. A single beat, steady and terrifying, and so low that it was heard not with the ears, but with the ribs. It was as if, in the depths beneath the depths, a giant heart had beaten once. Ishma closed her eyes and said, "Count." The second beat came after 1,000 breaths. The sleeper's heart was picking up speed. The ancestral mother of the whales had to be found before the heart below gained full momentum, and no one on the council knew where to begin the search except Thala. The elder said that the people of the depths had not seen the ancestral mother for 12 generations, but they remembered her path. Once every 100 years, she traveled along a single route, a cold current that his people call the Milky River, because the water there turns white from plankton. And the last time they heard her song was 96 years ago. If the count is correct, the window for her return is opening now. The Milky River flowed in the far north, a 12-day journey through waters that belonged to no one, because no one wished to live there. Ice, mists, and the masters of the mists. Thal called them Heart's Whalers, and Morven spat overboard at the mention of that name. Heart Redwater ruled the north as Rada ruled the south. Only instead of an arena, he had cutting rafts, and instead of gold, he had whale blubber, which he traded with all the barons at once. Garth's fleet was small but fearsome. 8 ice schooners with rams and harpoon guns, and crews for whom killing a whale the size of a hill was a craft, not a feat. If the Great Mother enters the Milky River this year, Garth will be the first to know. And for him, she will not be a voice of salvation, but the greatest catch in the history of the trade. Kaelin set sail northward 3 days later with 6 pennants, the Salty Dawn, the Widow's Eagle, the Hammer, and 3 new ships built by the Anvil during the campaign in Erna, the heavy frigate Anvil Daughter, and 2 ice sloops with bone-reinforced gunnels, which the shipyard had modeled after the designs for the armored hull. Liren remained to hold the south and west. Ishma traveled with the fleet and spent the entire journey transcribing the score from the overseer's log onto tanned leather, memorizing it, and forcing Neris to learn it as well. 11 days northward were spent navigating the ice cuts. First cut. On the 5th day, it grew so cold that the rigging became encrusted with ice, and the Southerners' crews learned what it meant to chop ice off the rigging every half watch. Second cut. On the 7th day, they passed through the first of Garth's ice fields. Rafts and bones and red water for a mile, and a stench the wind couldn't carry away. The Silent One stood at the rail, looking at the whale ribs jutting out of the ice, and for the first time ever, he made a sound, a low rumble from his chest. Cut 3. On the 9th day, they were caught in a pincer movement. 8 ice schooners emerged from the fog in a crescent formation, both windward and leeward ships at once, and executed the maneuver so flawlessly that Morvena cursed with admiration. Hart Redwater climbed aboard the Zarya on his own, without fear, all by himself. He turned out to be short and broad as a barrel, with the white eyes of a man who'd spent half his life gazing at the ice. He said he knew who Kalin was, and that the Southern Fleet commander had sailed far from home. The North does not wage war against the South as long as the South leaves the North's whales alone. He asked point-blank why the fleet had come into his midst. Kalin decided that with a man who walks alone onto a stranger's ship, it's more costly to be cunning than to tell the truth. He told him everything about the sleeper, the heartbeats, the score, and the Great Mother. Garth listened without interrupting, his white eyes betraying no emotion. Then he said something that made Ishma's lips turn white. He said the Southerner was 3 days late. The Prime Mother had already entered the Milky River. His lookouts had heard her song at dawn on the 3rd day, and his entire fleet was now heading to the same place he had been going, to the greatest hunt in the history of the North. There is so much fat and bristle in the Prime Mother that the North will be well fed for 10 years. And in a quiet, Garth added that he thanked the Southerner for the ridiculous tale about the end of the world, but he wouldn't call off the hunt. You can't fill your belly with fairy tales. What followed was a conversation that Kalin later recalled as the hardest battle of his life. He couldn't buy Garth off. Garth had more blubber than Kalin had gold. He couldn't scare Garth. The man with white eyes feared nothing but a hungry winter. And then Kalin asked Garth about his grandfather. Morvena had told him on the way that Garth's clan had been hunting whales for 8 generations, and that, according to legend, Garth's grandfather had once released a white female whale with her calf, and for that, the sea had granted his clan 20 years of the richest harvests. Kalin asked if Garth remembered why his grandfather had done that. Garth was silent for a long time. Then he said that his grandfather had put it this way: "The sea feeds those who know not to eat the heart of the sea." Kalin nodded and said that the Great Mother is the heart of the sea in the truest sense, that by killing her, the North would receive 10 years of plenty, but in the 11th year, the sea would not. Not like in a fairy tale, like at Lotane, where 3,000 fishermen sank to the bottom in a single night. He laid the warden's logbook and a map showing the dome of the abyss on the table and asked Garth for one thing: let the hunt go on, but let Garth be the first to look upon the primordial mother and listen to her song. And if, after that, his hand raises the harpoon, then Kalin's fleet of Kalin would leave the North without a fight. Garth agreed to this because it cost him nothing, or so he thought. Both fleets reached the Milky River together on the 11th day. The river opened up like a strip of white water 3 miles wide amid leaden ripples, and fountains rose above it. Hundreds of fountains. The entire northern whale tribe was moving southward down the river, and she was in the middle of the tribe. The Great Mother was not the size of a hill. She was the size of an island. Her back rose above the water like a gray ridge 1/4 of a mile high, pitted with scars and encrusted with coral like a reef, and upon it gleamed old, broken harpoons gleamed white like a forest after a fire. 12 generations of whalers had left their marks on her, and she had outlived them all. And then she began to sing. The song came not through the air but through the water, the hulls, and the bones. It was so deep and vast that the people on the decks clung to the rigging because their knees were giving out. There were no words in the song, but everyone heard their own. Kalin heard the creak of a raft made of 4 planks and the voice of his long-dead mother. Morvena turned away from everyone toward the ship's side. The silent one sank to his knees, and Ishma cried out through her tears that she heard a melody in the song. That very melody. The Great Mother was singing Hora's lullaby. She was not merely a voice capable of singing it. She was the last one who remembered it from the beginning of time. Garth Redwater stood at the bow of his lead schooner with the harpoon gun aimed, and the gunners waited for his signal. His hand did not rise. He stood there until the song ended. Then he turned to his 8 schooners and bellowed an order the North had not heard in 8 generations. "Harpoons into the water!" Redwater told his men that this winter they would eat seal meat, and that anyone who aimed their harpoon at the first mother's kin would have to answer to him personally. And to Kalin, he said quietly that his grandfather had been right, and that he, Garth, would not be the one to eat the heart of the sea. The North was entering into an alliance. 8 ice schooners, the ocean's finest harpooners, and all the fog charts. On one condition: when the fleet sailed into the waters of Wrath, the North would lead the charge. Who else but whalers know how to sail alongside the giants? The most impossible part remained: negotiating with the whale. It was neither the power nor the shipyard that accomplished this. It was Neris and Ishma. For 3 days, the mermaid and the witch ventured out into the white waters to meet the pod. Neris spoke to the young whales in the clicking language of the depths. Ishma sang passages from the keeper's score to the primordial mother. And on the 3rd day, the primordial mother replied. She repeated the passage Ishma had sung. Then she sang it again with a correction of 2 notes, and Ishma checked her journal and sat down where she had been standing. The primordial mother's correction matched the caretaker's footnote in the margins. The whale corrected the score from memory, a memory older than the sunken world. She knew why they had come. She had been traveling south along the Milky River, not in a circle through the centuries. She had heard the heartbeats from the abyss before anyone else, and was going there on her own, alone, to sing over the sleeper one last time. Rod led her to the edge of the warm waters and turned back, but the primordial mother went on, and Kalin's fleet and Garth's fleet set a course alongside her. They sailed like an honor guard on either side of the living island, and on the 4th night of the journey, Ishma woke Kalin, led her out onto the deck, and told her to listen. The primordial mother sang softly to herself in the darkness, and now there were pauses in her song. Ishma explained what she had gathered from these pauses and from 3 days of conversation. The primordial mother is old, older than anyone could be. The song over the sleeper requires holding the melody for many hours at a stretch, singing at full voice. She knows she will be able to finish the song, and she knows she will not be able to return. She had not traveled the Milky River to bypass the centuries. She had come to die, and she did not accept them as saviors, but as those who see her off. It was a 9-day journey to the waters of Wrath, and on the 2nd day, it became clear that they would have to live long enough to reach them. That night, Ishma sat up in her sleep with her eyes wide open and said that the water ahead was lying. The currents were not flowing where they had for 300 years, and in the morning, Garth's scout sloop returned from the advance patrol with news that was worse than the shifting currents. Ships were coming toward them. Many ships. Not just one Baron's armada, a motley fleet flying a dozen different flags, all from the south and the east. Liren caught up with her people on a mail skiff a day later and brought an explanation. While Kalin was heading north, the world behind him had gone mad with fear. The omens had become clear to everyone. The fish had vanished. Volcanoes were breathing. The sunken Lotan, followed by 2 more small islands. And fear found a preacher. Baron Gavardo's nephew, Velt, who had survived the Wolf's Ridge, gathered the remnants of the shattered fleets and the frightened barons of the east and gave them a simple explanation for it all. The sea does not rage on its own. The sea was roused by a ship witch who weaves ships from dead bones and befriends witches and monsters. The ship witch descended into the cursed city and disturbed the seabed. Hand the ship witch and his witch over to the sea, and the sea will calm down. The simplicity of the explanation triumphed over the truth. 37 pennants sailed under Velt's command, and they were not heading for Tarnak. Velt's scouts learned from a captured fisherman where Kalen's fleet was headed, and the crusade was heading straight into its path, right between the flotilla and the waters of wrath. Kalen convened a council on the deck of the Dawn, and the council was brief and bitter. Morvena said that 37 makeshift pennants were fewer than they seemed, because fear makes for poor discipline. Garth said that his schooners could pin down any flank, but no one could hold a whale in battle. The Prima Mother would not wait beyond the horizon. She was following her own path, and that path lay directly through the very spot where Velt was lying in ambush. And then Liren spoke up and proposed something that made half the council's jaws drop. She said that battle is defeat, even in the event of victory. Every ship Velt sinks means crews who are needed alive a week from now in the waters of wrath. Every day of battle is a day lost. So we must not crush fear. We must win it over. She reminded them that in the hold of the Anvil Daughter sat a prisoner captured back during the Wolf's Ridge campaign, Baron Gvardo, the preacher's uncle. A man whose word still carries more weight with the Eastern barons than that of his nephew. And she proposed an exchange that no one had ever made before, to show Gvardo the truth and release him to his own people. Kalen went down to the hold to see the Baron alone. During his months of captivity, Gvardo had grown gaunt and gray, but his eyes remained sharp. Kalen laid the captain's log and the maps before him and recounted everything from Erna to the Prima Mother. Then he said that in an hour the Baron would be taken up on deck, where he would see with his own eyes what had been discussed. And that evening, Gvardo stood at the rail as the Premother passed the flotilla at half a mile past the flotilla and sang a short evening phrase. The Baron clung to the gunwale and held on until his fingers turned white. That night, he asked for paper and a pen. In the morning, he told Kalen dryly that he hated him more than anyone in the world, that he would never forgive the Wolf Ridge until his dying day, but that he had seen the whale's back, scarred by the harpoons of 12 generations, and heard the song that had made his convoy weep, and that he, Baron Gvardo, would not allow his feeble-minded nephew to sink what remained of his fleet in a war against the last hope still afloat. He would sail to Velt, not for Kalen's sake, for the sake of his own islands, which stand upon the same waters as all the rest. He was sent off in a rowboat with a single oarsman within sight of Velt's forward patrols. For 2 days, the flotilla sailed at a slow pace, waiting and preparing for battle in case the Baron's word proved lighter than water. At the end of the second day, a lone yacht under a white sail approached from the direction of the assembled fleet, carrying Gvardo and 3 eastern barons with the ashen faces of men whose world had been turned upside down overnight. Velt refused to listen to his uncle and shouted about a witch's delusion. But the barons listened. Gvardo had brought them there to count for themselves. He told them the figures he'd memorized from Kalen, and the figures matched what the barons had seen off their own coasts. The dates the fish had left, the dates of the 3 sunken islands, the steady rhythm of the blows that their own divers were now hearing at depth. By dawn of the 3rd day, the assembled fleet had split up. 22 pennants, led by the barons of Vardo, slipped from Velt's grasp. 15 remained with the preacher, and Velt shouted after the departing ships that the sea would claim the traitors first. Kalin hoped that the split meant the end of the threat. Ishma said it was only the beginning. A cornered preacher is more dangerous than a well-fed one. And she turned out to be right, terrifyingly so, and quickly. Velt hadn't gone away. Velt followed the flotilla 3 hours behind for the next few days, like a wolf trailing a wagon train. He didn't engage in battle. He waited. And the flotilla entered the waters of Wrath and understood why no pilots had ventured here for 300 years. The sea here had forgotten its own laws. Cut 1. The sky was green as old bronze, and lightning struck from it without thunder, shooting upward from within the water. Second scene. The currents swirled in rings, and the rings moved against the wind. The compasses all lied in their own way, and Lirin guided the fleet by the stars that were visible through gaps once a day. Third scene. On the second day, they passed a field of dead ships from all eras, standing on their level keels in the still water as if on parade. Garth forbade his men from looking at them for longer than a single breath. Cut 4. Heartbeats from below became audible without any trumpets, simply through the soles of their feet. The interval between beats had shortened to 300 breaths. The Great Mother moved through it all as smoothly as a needle through fabric, and her presence held the people together better than any orders. On the 5th day, they reached the dome of the abyss. The place opened up suddenly, a ring-shaped lagoon 10 miles across, where the water lay as smooth as glass amid the raging sea all around. In the middle of the lagoon, the water bulged, not in a wave, but in a constant, gentle dome as tall as a mast, as if something from below were propping it up, something one must not dwell on for long. Beneath the dome, at an immeasurable depth, lay the sleeper, and every beat of his heart rippled across the glassy water in a ring of ripples from the center to the edges. Ishma recited the order she had learned from the keeper and verified with the First Mother. They must sing from dawn to dawn, a full day of unbroken song. The primordial mother will stand at the very center of the dome. Ishma and Neris will accompany her on the 2 bells as counterpoint, leading the sections of the score that require a second voice. The fleet will form an outer ring along the edge of the lagoon, and its task is simple and terrifying. For a full day, to let no one and nothing. Because the keeper wrote plainly, "The awakening sleeper calls." Everything mad and hungry in the ocean for 100 miles hears his heart as a command to go and kill. And on the last night, guards from all the flooded cities came to the dome at his call. They began preparing in the evening so they could sing at dawn, and at twilight the patrol schooners of Garth gave a signal from outside the ring. Sails were entering the waters of Wrath from the northwest. 15 of Velt's pennants were heading for the lagoon at full sail, straight across the raging sea, losing their rigging but not slowing down. The preacher realized where the flotilla was headed and decided the only thing his mind, scorched by fear, could decide. He would not let the sorcerer finish his spell. He would stop the song at any cost. And from the south, at that very moment, Neris rose from the depths and delivered her second report. Answering the call of their hearts, the guards were making their way along the seabed. She counted 11 of them, and among them was one twice the size of the serpent from the Forge of the Depths. Kalin stood on the deck of the Dawn between these 2 pieces of news, gazing at the smooth water of the dome. Dawn was 8 hours away. The song demanded a full day of silence and order. But madmen and mad beasts were advancing on the lagoon from both sides, and it was already impossible to separate them in time. He turned to the council and said calmly that the plan would not change. Only the cost would change. The fleet would absorb both strikes on the outer ring and hold the ring for a day. Garth would take the north against Velt. Morvena and Rad will lead the reserves through the pilot channels. The Silent One and boarding parties will attack the guards from the flanks. He himself, aboard the Dawn, will take his position where the breach is worst. He looked around at everyone and added quietly that by sunset tomorrow they would either grant the ocean a rest or sink to its depths. And the primordial mother in the darkness of the lagoon sang a single long note, as if sealing those words with her mark. Dawn broke gray, and with the first light, the primordial mother stepped to the center of the dome and struck the first note, and at that note, the hearts of the 3,000 people on the outer ring skipped a beat all at once. The song began. The countdown began, and a quarter of an hour later, the first sails of the Welt entered the lagoon from the northwest. Kaelin had arranged the ring as follows. The north was held by Garth with 8 ice schooners and 10 pennants of the flotilla. The south, facing the guards, was held by the Hammer and the Anvil Daughter, along with all the gunboats carrying harpoon crews of whalers on their decks. Morvena with the Needle and Rad with his pilots patrolled inside the ring as a rapid response reserve. Zarya stood at the center, at the entrance to the central channel, as the final barrier before the primordial mother. Liren, along with Anvil Daughter, kept track of everything: time, the breathing of the bells, and gaps in the formation. Velt struck them head-on without guile, just as fear strikes. 15 pennants formed a wedge, and the wedge advanced toward the northern sector amid the wail of the horns and the preacher's cries, which the wind carried across the water. Garth met them as the north meets everything, silently and with certainty. The ice schooners did not wait for a head-on clash. They fanned out and began to cut through the wedge from the flanks with harpoon guns, knocking out helmsmen and rigging from a distance at which the Southerners could not even return fire. 3 of Velt's ships lost their momentum within the first hour. But the wedge was heavier and more stubborn than they had anticipated, and its core, composed of 6 large ships, broke through the fan formation and headed for the strait. Then Kaelin ceded the north to Morven, and the Eagle, along with 2 brigs, struck the core's flank, and a side-to-side melee ensued, and in that melee, time began to work in the ring's favor. The song continued. Every hour the enemy spent fighting at the outer edge was an hour during which the Great Mother sang calmly. By noon, the guards answered the call of the heart, and the southern sector learned the true cost of a day. 11 shadows rose from the depths along the entire southern arc at once. Gunboats pelted the heads of the surfacing creatures, and Garth's whalers were doing the work of a lifetime, driving harpoons with ropes into the creatures' throats and gills, and winding the ropes onto capstans in full cruise. 2 guards were drowned after being bound with crisscrossing ropes from all 4 sides of the ship. Molchen, along with a boarding party of 50, took the 3rd guard aboard the Hammer's deck when the creature crawled out onto the forecastle. After that battle, only a 1/3 of the boarding party remained, and Molchen stood covered in black blood, holding the creature's severed head aloft like a banner. But the giant that Neris had seen was the last to pass beneath the southern arch, diving deep and not resurfacing. It passed beneath the southern arch without touching anyone. Liren was the first to understand the maneuver and began into the intercom that the large creature wasn't heading for the ships. It was heading under the ring, inward. At the sound of her voice, what followed was an hour that Kaelin would later see in his dreams for the rest of his life. The giant surfaced inside the ring, half a mile from the Primother. It was like 3 serpents from the forge woven into one, and on its back, amid the growths, jutted the fragments of alien keels. Between it and the singer stood only Zarya and the 2 bells of the echoes. The Primother did not flinch or falter. She sang. Such was the order. To interrupt the song meant losing everything, and she would not have interrupted it now, even for the sake of her own life. Zarya charged head-on at the giant. Kaelin stood at the ram himself, and the shipyard, at his command, did what it had never done before. Right on the move, it reshaped the ship's bow, channeling the entire supply of armored bone from the hold into the ram, extending the tusk to 3 times its former length. They collided. The impact was so great that the masts burst and half the crew was knocked off their feet. The ram sank a 1/3 of the way beneath the creature's first fin and lodged there, and the giant dragged the ship along with it like a harpoon float. And then, from both sides, came those the creature had not counted on. Nereus emerged from her bell with all the swimmers, and they swarmed the giant's head, striking it in the eyes with harpoons. And Ishma opened the bell of the second bell and sang a counterpoint, not for the primordial mother, but against the creature. That very same lullaby that the serpent had used to silence the forge. The giant was torn between three pains, the song calling it down and the song lulling it to sleep. The great mother finished the job herself. Without breaking the rhythm, she wove into the song a single long note from which the water around the giant rose in a pillar of tremors, and the beast convulsed and sank to the bottom, dragging the stuck tusk with it, while the shipyard, on Kalen's command, blew the ram to pieces. The giant sank and never resurfaced. By sunset, Velt had thrown everything he had left into the channel, 7 ships and his own flagship. The preacher set out to destroy the song himself. He was met by Morvena and Garth from both sides, and Rada blocked the exit from the strait by flooding it with 2 captured hulls. At twilight, by the light of the burning wreckage, the Widow's Eagle collided side to side with the flagship, and Morvena boarded it within a quarter of an hour. Velt was found in his cabin. He didn't put up a fight. He was sitting on the floor, covering his ears and rocking back and forth because the song of the primordial mother echoed through all the hulls, leaving no room in his head for anything else. They tied him up and carried him away, and with that, the crusade fleet was finished. The night was the worst part of the day. The guards answered the call one by one and in pairs until dawn, and the men collapsed from exhaustion by the ballistas and got back up again. Liren counted the song's hours aloud, and her voice through the speaking tubes held the ring together no worse than ropes. As the night drew to a close, the breathing in the bells of echoes came to an end, and Nereus and Ishma finished singing their parts while standing in the open hatches, up to their necks in the night water. And the Prime Mother sang. The 20th hour. The 22nd. By dawn, her voice had grown lower, and a crack appeared in it like that of an old bell, yet she held the pitch as steadily as Erna's machine had done 300 years ago. And at dawn, everyone standing on the decks heard what the day had been dying for. The heartbeats from below began to spread out. 300 breaths between beats. 500. 1,000. The dome of water in the middle of the lagoon sank slowly, like the chest of someone falling asleep. With the last ray of the first sun, the Great Mother took the final note of the score and held it so long that it seemed the note would remain in the world forever. Then silence fell, and in the silence, everyone heard that the heart from below could no longer be heard at all. The sleeper slept, and the Great Mother lay on her side on the water, her enormous eye gazing at the dawn, and Ishma, standing chest-deep in the water beside that eye, wept and spoke words of gratitude to her in every language she knew. The primordial mother was dying by noon. Her kin heard her even from here, though they would not have had time to reach her, and she sang one last short phrase not from the score. Ishma later translated it into a single line. Now sing it yourselves. By noon, the eye had closed. Kalen ordered what he deemed the only right course of action. The shipyard left the body untouched. The fleet towed the mothership to the ring reef of the lagoon, where they lowered her into the shallows, and Ishma spoke over her the words with which the people of the sea bid their own farewell. Nothing was built from her bones. The mothership's burial site was declared forbidden waters for all time. The ring lost 9 ships and 411 people in a single day, and Liren read the list of names aloud all evening. And at night, While the living slept the sleep of the dead, Kalin stood alone on the shattered deck of the Dawn, gazing at the smooth black water, understanding with his mind that he had won, but with his heart that he had merely survived, and that now the most unfamiliar thing would begin: life after. Life after began with a question that Kalin hadn't even had time to ask himself, because it was asked of him. On the third day after the song, while the fleet was tending to its wounds at the edge of the waters of wrath, the yacht Gvardo approached the Dawn, and the old baron came aboard without an entourage. He placed a folded sheet of paper on the table in front of Kalin and said that these were signatures. 11 barons from the south, east, and north had signed the same document. They were asking the man who had calmed the sea to take the sea under his wing, not as a baron above the barons, but as the emperor of the ocean. Vardo said this with his usual dryness and added that he himself had been the first to sign and that he hadn't stopped hating Kalin. He'd simply realized that order was more important than hatred. Kalin looked at the sheet and remained silent for a long time. Then he said he would give his answer after he had finished 2 tasks: burying his own and keeping the promise he'd made to the dead woman. The first task took a week. The fleet sailed home through waters that were already changing. Fish were returning to places that had once been barren in schools so vast that the water boiled. Ishma said that the ocean was recovering from its long fear, just as a person recovers from an illness. In Tarnak, the fallen were met by the entire village and all the islands. 411 names were carved onto bone tablets, and the tablets were raised on the wall of the dock next to Korma's staff. Velta was put on trial before everyone. Kalin refused to let him be executed. The preacher was taken to a distant island under guard, and Morven grumbled that mercy would someday come back to haunt them, while Lirin objected that a dead madman would become a symbol, but a living, broken one would become a nobody. The second matter was more difficult: the covenant of the first mother. Now sing for yourselves. Ishma understood these words to the very core. The sleeper has been lulled to sleep, but not forever. The song of the days has granted him a slumber for a century or 2, but then his heart will begin to beat again. And if the world wants to live longer than 2 centuries, then the song must not be sung just once, but must be sung forever, just as it had been sung for 300 years from Irna. This meant rebuilding the chorus anew, not finding a new voice. We must become the voice ourselves. Thus was born the project that Kalin called the Last Shipyard, his first construction project not intended for war. The plan was devised by the entire council. They could not build a machine on the scale of Irna. The overseer wrote this plainly. But the overseer did not know the shipyard. Kalin proposed something else. Not a single great machine, but a network of small ones. Singing buoys made of bronze and armor bone, with pipes tuned to a score that maintain their harmony through the movement of the waves on their own, without people. 100 buoys forming a ring around the dome of the abyss, and a single temple station alongside them, staffed by a rotating crew of overseers who listen, repair, and train the next generation. Ishma added her own thoughts. The score cannot be entrusted solely to metal. Metal falls silent, just as it did in Irna. The score must be entrusted to living voices and passed down just as language is passed down. She said she would open a school, the first school of the singing sea, where the harmony of the human choir and the people of the depths would be taught together. Neris said that her people would provide the school with its first students because the depth's debt to the primordial mother is now eternal. Construction proceeded in phases throughout the fall and winter. Phase 1. The forge and the second floating shipyard, built to match it, cast and hone buoys, and Ishma and Liren check each buoy against the overseer's log, note by note. Second phase. Garth transports bronze from the north and Radha from Sorrow, and the two former enemies bicker at every dock, yet cannot work without each other. Cut 3. In the waters of Wrath, which have grown as still as a pond, a ring of buoys rises, along with a temple station on pontoons made of whalebone gifted by the clan of the Great Mother. The clan itself brought the bones of its dead from across the century to the construction site, and Ishma said that the sea had never shown greater trust to anyone. Cut 4. In the spring, the ring began to sing. 100 trumpets took their tune from the waves and held it, and the sound traveled across the water for dozens of miles, even and low, and people on the farthest islands heard it at night like a distant breath and slept more soundly because of it. The skeptic of this construction project was the person from whom Kaelin least expected it, Dreg. The old scrap dealer came to the ring's opening and navigated among the buoys in his boat, feeling every seam just as he'd once felt the hull of a Velbot. For 40 years he'd been dismantling the dead, and he didn't believe that the dead could be made to sing for the living. He sat at the station for 3 days, listening in silence. Then he came to Kaelin and said he would stay there as a caretaker. That his whole life he had hauled the bones of the world to sell, and now, as a final act, he wanted to watch over its dream. Thus, the temple station gained its first leader, and no one was surprised that it was a scavenger from the graveyard. By summer, the Prime Mother's task was complete, and it was no longer possible to postpone a response to the barons. Kaelin gathered everyone on Tarnak, the barons, the elders, the captains, Garth, Rad, Gavardo, and his own people. He stepped out before them with Horm's staff in his hand and announced what he had decided over the winter. He accepts. But he accepts not as they ask, not the rule of one over all. He builds ships and knows that a ship held together by a single nail sinks first. The Ocean Empire will be a council of all the waters, where the barons and island elders, the free captains, the people of the depths, the north and the south all sit. The council decides on laws and taxes. The emperor is left with the fleet, the court, the protection of the weak, and the sleep of the sleeper. And one more thing. The title is not inherited by blood. The emperor names his heir during his lifetime, and the council confirms the choice. Because the sea does not ask whose son someone is. The sea asks who holds the helm. The barons argued for 3 days. Gavardo argued the loudest, and then he was the first to stand up and say that the old world, which passed power from father to fool, had sunk 300 years ago, and it was time to admit it. On the 4th day, the council voted. That fall, in the Tarnak Lagoon, on the deck of the newly built Zarya, amid 1,000 pennants in the roadstead of Ishma, Kaelin was not crowned. Instead, she was given a headband made of armored bone, with a single bronze tube from the first buoy fused above her forehead. The Emperor of the Ocean was not crowned with gold. He was crowned with the sleep he had given to the sea. And on the night after the coronation, while the guests slept, Kaelin stepped out onto the empty deck and found all his people there. They had come one by one without coordinating. Neris sat on the deck with her tail in the water. Morvena stood at the helm. Ishma and Liren were at the chart table. And Kaelin looked at them and realized, with a clarity that made his throat tighten, that the empire he had been building for 7 years did not sail on ships. It sailed on these 4. And that the hardest conversation of his life was still ahead of him, and that this conversation was not about fleets. The conversation that Kaelin had been putting off for 7 years was not initiated by him, but by Morvena, and she began it the way she did everything, head on. A week after the coronation, she walked into his cabin without knocking, threw a knife on the table, and said she'd come to discuss a matter in which knives were of no help. She said that the empire stood, the fleets were deployed, and the sleeper slept. That she'd lived at sea for 42 years and feared nothing but one word, but she would say it. She'd chosen him back in the Rada arena when she watched him rise after Molchun's blows. And she wanted to know straight up, just like in a boarding action. Yes or no. Because besides her, 3 others are peering through that door, and they're all waiting for him to chicken out for another year. Kalen didn't answer right away, but when he did, he answered honestly. That he is neither blind nor heartless. That to Neris he owes his first faith, to Morvine his first sense of equality, to Ishmi his perspective on the world, and to Lirin order in his own mind. That he loved each of the 4, and loved them differently, and for 7 years he'd been afraid of that word because he was afraid to choose. Choosing one meant losing 3, and he couldn't lose a single one. Morvena listened, snorted, and said that men always complicate what the sea had long since decided. Then she turned and left, and an hour later, Kalen learned what she had done. She had gathered the other 3. The 4 women's conversation continued in Zari's wardroom until late into the night, and Kalen was not allowed in. Molchun stood by the door, and when the Emperor tried to enter his own mess hall, the deckhand, for the first time in years of service, blocked his path with his hand. Kalen never found out exactly what they discussed in there. Lirin later mentioned that there had been a game of cards and an argument, and that at one point Neris had gone for a swim to cool off, while Ishma was reading the stars the dice, and the dice fell in such a way that all 4 fell silent at once. In the morning they came out to him together, and Lirin spoke as the most precise among them. She said that they had conducted a complete review of the situation. According to maritime custom, which predates all baronial laws, the Emperor of the Ocean is free to take as many wives as his ship has decks, provided that each ascends deck of his own free will and with an equal share. This custom is recorded in the Old World's nautical charts, and she had verified it. All 4 shares are equal, and all 4 are of goodwill. The matter is settled and not open to discussion, and the only one who can ruin everything is the Emperor himself if he starts spouting nonsense now about someone being more worthy than another. Kalen opened his mouth, and Morvena said, "That's exactly what I'm talking about," and covered his mouth with her hand. The wedding took place on the day of the spring flood, when, according to legend, all the waters of the sea come together. It was such a spectacular event that songs were later composed about it from the north all the way to shallow water. 1,000 pennants flew in Tarnak's harbor. Garth brought an iceberg, and an ice table was carved out of it. Rada organized a tournament in his arena in honor of the brides, and Molchun won it without killing anyone. The lineage of the primordial mother arrived at the lagoon, and the whales beat their tails in a salute. The rites were performed 4 times according to 4 different customs. Neris Kalena was wed to the depths, and he stood with her at the bottom of the lagoon in a bone cauldron, while Elder Thal joined their hands underwater by the light of the polyps. With Morvena, they were wed by the boarding custom of the free captains. Both leaped from the yards of their ships into the water between the hulls and surfaced holding a single rope in their hands. With Ishma, they were wed by a storm that the witch had summoned herself, and the 2 of them stood together on the bow beneath the lightning, and Ishma laughed like a little girl. With Lirin, the wedding was quiet, according to the custom of her native island. An exchange of sextants and a single joint entry in the logbook of the Zarya. Lirin wouldn't let anyone read it. And then the years went by, years that Kalen later recalled as the happiest and fastest passing time of his life. They passed in flashes. Flashback 1. The Empire is growing without war. Archipelagos, previously known only by rumor, are asking to join the Council of All Waters. Kalen now has 7 shipyards. Floating cities rise on bone pontoons where there had once been nothing, and the first of them is called Hormgrad. Snapshot 2. The School of Ishma graduates its first singers, and among them the best is Horm's granddaughter, that very girl from the Broken Fang Cliff. Shifts at the temple station run like clockwork, and old Dreg dies there off duty, and he is buried in a ring of buoys to the sound of their singing. Cut 3. Children. Morvina is the first to give birth, and her daughter screams so loudly that her mother weeps with pride. Then comes Lirin's son, quiet and big-eyed, just like his mother, with a head full of numbers. Then comes Ishma's daughter, who has been able to sense the weather since she was 3. Neris's child comes last of all and, according to the laws of the depths, is born in water. A boy with gills and lungs at once. The first in the world born of 2 peoples, and Thal weeps over him and says he sees in him a bridge across all waters. The 4 children grow up as one pack on the decks and docks, and the entire ocean considers them its own. Scene 4th. Old enemies depart. Gvardo dies in his bed, having managed to dictate a letter to Kalin in which, for the first and last time, he calls him the son he never had. Velt quietly lives out his days on his island and, before his death, asks that one word be conveyed to the Emperor: "Forgive me." Kalin grows old and gray, still wearing his bone ring, and the shipyard still obeys his every command, though he hardly ever opens any new blueprints. Everything that needed to be built has been built. And in the 15th year of peace, on the quietest night of autumn, Ishma wakes him. She stands over him, gray-haired and upright, and her eyes see right through him, just as they did on that first day on the shore of Tarnak. She speaks softly so as not to wake the house. The ring is singing out of tune. She heard it in her sleep across all those miles. One of the 100 buoys went off-key by a quarter note and then corrected itself. For the sea, it's nothing. For her, it's the first yellow leaf. The metal has begun to age, just like it once did in Urna. They have years and perhaps decades, but one day the ring won't be enough, and they'll have to sing with their own voices. And there is only one living voice in the world with that kind of power. The school is small, and its best student is just coming of age. Kalin sits in the darkness and listens to the breathing of the sleeping house and the distant breathing of the ring beyond the horizon. And he realizes that the final chapter of his life is beginning right now. He built an empire. Now he must build something that will outlive the empire. The first yellow leaf turned out to be a harbinger not of autumn but of a storm, and the storm arrived faster than anyone had anticipated. 2 years after that night, the ring faltered a second time, and not by a quarter note this time. Buoy number 37 fell completely silent for half a day until the caretaker shift replaced the cracked pipe. Half a day of silence at a single point on the ring. Lirin gathered all the station logs and calculated what they'd been afraid to calculate. The bronze of the old world from Sorrow had lasted 300 years because it lay idle in the cold. Bronze that sings on a wave wears out 100 times faster. The ring had less than a decade left. The ring had about 7 years left. And then, from the depths, confirmation of the worst arrived. Neris and her son returned from a distant patrol near the Waters of Wrath, and Neris was as pale as she had been on the day of the silent depths. She said that a heartbeat could be heard again beneath the dome, 1 beat for every 10,000 breaths. Infinitely rare. But 2 years ago, not even that existed. The sleeper had not awakened. The sleeper had begun to hear the false beat through his sleep, just as a man hears a clock that has lost its rhythm through a doze. The Imperial Council convened in Hormgrad, and Kalin laid everything out before them honestly. The ring is dying. There is nothing to replace the bronze. The reserves have been exhausted, and there is no more of the old metal left in the world. The new bronze cast by its shipyards fades away within a year. Urna's overseer was right. They cannot build a machine of that power. The only path left is that of the primordial mother, the living voice. But the primordial mother has carried the song within her since the beginning of time, while the people of the depths must learn the melody in 5 years, and it will take more than one voice. Ishma calculated according to her science. To sustain the song eternally through shifts, 40 singers at full strength were needed at once, yet the school had produced only 9 in 17 years, and of those 9, only 1 possessed full strength. Harem's granddaughter. Her name was Selah, and she was 24. Then came 5 years, which the empire later called the years of the last song, and they passed in waves. The first. The school of Ishma becomes the heart of the empire. By decree of the council, every island and every clan listens to the children, and all who possess a musical ear are taken to Tarnak. Out of thousands, only dozens remain. They teach everyone, humans and the people of the depths. 2 young people from the primordial Mother's clan who sailed to the lagoon on their own and came to rest by the school, just as ships come to rest at the dock. The second phase. Kalen and the shipyard build something that has never been built before. Not a ship, nor a weapon. A temple of song above the dome of the abyss. A floating cathedral of bone, a gift from the primordial Mother's clan, with a chalice at its center that gathers and amplifies the voice like a conch shell. The shipyard has grown stronger over the years, and now Kalen weaves living coral into the bone, so that the temple is half built, half grown. Cut 3. Selah leads the first singers and teaches them in a way even Ishma never did. She lifts them up to the temple station and makes them sing a duet with the dying ring, catching the metal's false notes and covering them with her voice. This is the future of the craft. Don't sing in place of the ring. First, sing over its old age. Scene 4. Ishma is aging before our eyes. She has given everything to the school, and one winter she calmly tells Kalen that the bones of the currents have shown her her own end. She will see the first shift at the bowl. There won't be a second one. At the end of the 5th year, something happened that threw off all the timelines. The northern earthquake. The seabed trembled 1,000 miles from the dome, but the waves swept through all the waters, and the ring took a blow that no calculation had anticipated. 11 buoys fell silent in a single night. The song's harmony broke not by a quarter of a note. A hole opened in it, as wide as an hour of silence, while the shifts scrambled between the buoys. And the depths answered. The heart beat and beat again, and the interval dropped from 10,000 breaths to 1,000. The dome of water above the sleeper swelled in a single day to the height of a mast. From the silent depths, the frenzied guards, unseen for 20 years, once again streamed toward the waters of wrath. The slumber was ending. The sleeper turned toward the apparitions. The empire responded just as Kalen had taught it 20 years ago. Not with panic, but with action. The fleets of all the waters formed a ring around the lagoon, just as they had the first time, only now there were not 30 pennants, but 800, and the guards were met by barriers erected over the course of a week, according to the blueprints of the old battle. Garth, aged but still upright, led the northern fleet. Radu was replaced by the Silent One of Shallow Waters, who led the pilots. Morvena assumed overall command of the ring, and her voice over the speaking tubes was as firm as it had been 30 years ago. And in the center of the lagoon, on a bone cathedral, it was not a machine that rose. A choir was rising. 40 singers of Selah. People and the folk of the depths gathered at the chalice, and 2 young whales of the primordial Mother's lineage took their positions in the water alongside the ship's sides. They decided to begin the song without waiting for the ring's repairs to be completed, because there was nothing left to wait for. Hearts below were racing. Ishma climbed onto the cathedral on her own, refusing to be helped. She stood by the chalice next to Selah, not as a teacher, but as the lead voice of the first shift. Kalen watched her from the deck of the Zari and understood everything, yet could say nothing because there was nothing to say. She turned around once. Her eyes found him, and she smiled the way she smiled at storms. The song began at sunset. 40 voices and 2 whale voices found their pitch, and the bowl gathered them into one, and that single voice settled on the water and drifted downward. It was not as immense as the voice of the Great Mother. It was different. The Great Mother sang alone, as a mountain sings. The choir sang as a forest sings, through many roots, and the depths listened. All night long, heartbeats vied with the song, and the intervals leapt, and Liren counted aloud, and for the first time in her entire life, her voice trembled. By the third watch, the choir began to prevail. 1,000 breaths between beats. 3,000. At dawn, Ishma led with her voice through the most difficult passage of the score, the one where the custodian had written in the margins. Here the machine always went off key, but the primordial mother corrected it. Ishma sang it flawlessly. The heart below beat for the last time, far away and softly, like a door being closed. And it fell silent. The dome collapsed. The guards in the ring of fleets simultaneously lost their fury and retreated into the depths. And Ishma sang her shift to the very last note, passed the tune to Selah from hand to hand, just as one passes the helm, and sat down by the chalice, never to rise again. She died just as she had wished, in song, on duty, having witnessed the first shift. She was buried according to the rite she herself had chosen in advance, neither in water nor in earth. She was placed in a small bone boat, and the boat was raised to the top of the cathedral above the chalice, so that she might remain forever above the song. Kaelin stood there until dark. Selah approached, her eyes red, and said that the shifts were scheduled a year in advance. The school was full, and there would be plenty of voices, that the teacher had managed to do it all. Kaelin nodded and couldn't reply. Behind him, 40 voices sang in unison, and among them, until the end of the night, he heard one that he would now always seek out in this song. After Ishma, Kaelin lived another 21 years, and those years were like calm, still waters after all the storms of his life. The Empire no longer waged war because there was no one left to fight, and no reason to do so. The Council of All Waters convened twice a year to debate taxes, trade routes, and fishing quotas, and Kaelin sat through these meetings, growing quieter with each passing year and increasingly realizing that the Empire functioned perfectly well without him. This did not offend him. That was the point. A ship is built correctly if it sails without the master's hand at the helm. The children had grown up. Morvena's daughter commanded the Western Fleet and took after her mother in temperament, so much so that the old captains crossed themselves with both hands. Liren's son took charge of all the shipyards and the audit offices, and the anvils obeyed him as they had once obeyed his father, even though the shipyards were not in his hands. He ruled with precision. Ishma's daughter became the second voice of the choir at sail, and her storm premonitions saved the caravans every year. And Neris's son, the one born with gills and lungs, became what the old Thal had seen in him, the bridge. He spoke all the languages of water and land, and when another people of the depths were discovered in the far south, he led the negotiations. He led them, and led them so well that within a year, the southern depths were begging to be admitted to the cathedral. The old guard departed one by one, and Kaelin himself saw each one off. Garth Redwater died in the ice on his schooner, harpoon in hand, just as he had wished. Thal returned to his native cold waters to die according to the custom of the depths, and Neris saw him off to the edge of darkness. Rada lived to be 90, and died in his arena from laughter during a fight he himself was refereeing. Mulchun lived on. The Deep Ones live longer than humans. He stood behind Kaelin's shoulder all those years, a gray rock, aging so slowly that he seemed eternal. In the 74th year of his life, Kaelin convened a council ahead of schedule and did what he no longer wished to postpone. He named an heir. The Empire had been waiting for any one of the 4 children, and half the waters had been arguing about it at every dock for 20 years. Kalen stepped before the council with a hoop in his hands and said that the sea does not ask whose son a man is. The sea asks who holds the helm. And he named Selah, the granddaughter of Elder Horm, the singer who had kept the sleeper's dream alive for 30 years and knew the value of silence better than anyone alive. He said that the empire was born not of the sword, but of song, and that song must inherit it. The hall was silent for a long time. Then Morvena's daughter was the first to rise and placed her captain's knife on the table, the hilt facing Selah. The other 3 children and the entire council followed her. The vote was unanimous, the first time in the council's history. Morvena died at the age of 80, in her sleep, in her cabin on Widow's Needle, which she had never agreed to exchange for a palace. Liren outlived her by 3 years and kept the empire's main journal until her last day. The final entry in it was written in her own hand, neat and without any erasures. The balance has been settled. Only Kalen and Neris remain, for the people of the depths live long lives, and Neris hardly aged at all, and in this lay the final sorrow and the final mercy of his life. She was by his side every day. In his final year, Kalen handed the ring to Selah before all the waters and retired from his duties entirely, doing what he had secretly dreamed of for 40 years. He built his final ship. He built it alone, without assistance, in the old Tarnak dock, where he had once repaired Dreg's Velbot. The shipyard obeyed his hands just as easily as it had on the very first day. The ship turned out small, a single-masted sloop for 1 person, 14 paces long, an exact replica of the firstborn, down to the very last seam. Only now, every seam was perfect, because the master had been striving toward that perfection his entire life. In the spring, on the day of the flood, when all the waters converge, Kalen set out alone in that sloop from the Tarnak lagoon. He told Neris where he was going, and she did not try to dissuade him because she knew him longer and better than anyone else. He sailed slowly across his entire empire, and the empire sensed his approach and came out to the water's edge. He passed the cemetery of 1,000 masts, where a memorial shipyard now stood, and young master builders were learning their craft on the old hulls. Past the shallow waters, where the Silent One had led all his people onto the sandbars, and the pilots saluted with their oars. Past the floating cities, and past the ring-shaped reef where the primordial mother lay, and there he lowered his sail and remained silent for a long time. He reached the dome of the abyss at sunset. The cathedral sang. The Selah guard kept the rhythm, and the sound lay on the water, even and eternal as a breath. Kalen did not climb up to the cathedral. He dropped anchor with his little sloop in the cableway and remained alone on deck, listening. Neris emerged at the rail just as she had 50 years ago and placed her hands on the gunwale, and he covered them with his palm. And so they spent the night. He died at dawn, sitting quietly by the mast, facing the sunrise, with his hand resting on Neris's, and the last thing he heard was the song. All the waters of the world buried him. In accordance with his will, the shipyard carried out the final order entrusted to it in advance. The launch carrying the master's body unstitched itself in the middle of the dome's lagoon and folded into a bony skiff, and the depths took the skiff in. Not as prey, as one of their own. Neris and her son accompanied him to the edge of the world, where the sun reaches, and there they let him go. And above, Selah paused the shift for a single breath, the first break in 30 years. And 40 voices and 2 whales sang a single note not from the score. A note of farewell that the primordial mother had once sung. Then the harmony closed, and the song continued on, because a song never stops. 100 years passed, and then another 100, The ocean empire stood and was now simply called the world, because no one remembered any other world. The cathedral of all waters had grown to encompass 100 peoples. There were now 3 singing cathedrals, and the choirs succeeded one another through all the generations without ever breaking the harmony. Children on all the islands were taught the same story, that once upon a time the world had drowned, and a single man remained on the empty waters on a raft made of 4 planks. That he had nothing but his hands, his stubbornness, and the gift of weaving the dead into the living. That he did not seek revenge on the sea for taking the land away from the people. He made a deal with the sea. He gathered what had been scattered. He ransomed the captive. He outbid the huntress. He won over the old man. He trusted the defector. He embraced the witch. He reawakened the whaler's memory of his grandfather and the baron's conscience. And when the destruction of all things rose from the depths, he did not forge a weapon against it. He composed a lullaby. This story was told differently in the north and in the south, but it always ended the same way. The storyteller would fall silent and ask his listeners to go down to the water's edge and listen. And on a quiet night, from any shore in the world, one could hear how far above the abyss the song breathed, steady and eternal. Kalen's empire was not within borders where there is no water, not in fleets that crumble away. It was in that sound. As long as the song plays, destruction sleeps and everything else lives. And the song rang out, and there was no one to stop it, because now everyone was singing it. Orangeld learned that the world would end 11 days before the moon split, and he was the first to know because he himself had built the ears that heard it. He was 42 years old. He served as the chief master of voices at the Tower of Hearing in the city of Irna, and his position was considered an honor and a useless one. The Tower of Hearing stood in the central square next to the temple, and its 1,000 bronze trumpets listened to the sky, the earth, and the sea, bound by a pact as old as the ancient powers themselves. Irna was a free city between 2 celestial powers and listened to both so as not to be crushed by either. Oren grew up among the tubes. His father had tuned them before him, and his grandfather before his father. He could tell a distant thunderstorm from a distant war by the tremor of the bronze, and all his life he believed he would never hear the latter because the celestial powers would never go to war. Their weapons were too terrifying. That's what everyone said. That night, he remained alone in the tower to check the autumn tunings, and during the 3rd watch, the trumpets began to sound in a way that was not human, not with sound, with a tremor felt in the bones. Oren took readings 3 times and 3 times refused to believe it. On the 4th time, he sank to the cold floor of the tower because his legs gave out. Irna's ears heard the pounding of battle-ready hearts. Both celestial fortresses of the 2 powers were breaking free from their age-old anchors above the poles and moving toward one another. The war of the ancient forces was beginning, and it began all at once. In the morning, he reported to the city council, and the council did what all councils do before the end of the world. The council didn't believe him. The elder said that the Master of Voices was overworked, that the fortresses conducted maneuvers once a generation, that panic would cripple trade. Oren stood before them with his wax-sealed records and realized that numbers could not defeat hope. Then he made the first of the decisions for which he would later pay, though not personally. He lied. He told the council that he had likely made a mistake and asked only for permission to conduct training exercises at the tower. They granted permission readily, just to get him to shut up. And under the guise of training exercises, Oren, along with his 20 apprentices, began doing what he would never have been able to do honestly amid all the arguments. He began preparing the tower not to listen, but to sing. Here it must be noted that the Masters of Voices knew what the council did not. The battle hearts of the heavenly fortresses were not machines in the simple sense. They were cultivated, not assembled, half living,
half-stone hearts, a force that cannot be killed because it is not alive, and cannot be persuaded because it is not rational. They were controlled by a pattern of sounds. Precise sequences awakened the heart and drove it into battle, and precise sequences put it into hibernation. There were 2 realms and 2 harmonies, and the masters of Urna knew both harmonies because the Free City had spent 300 years repairing auditory machines for both sides and had signed a pact of silence in return. Orin now broke that silence with every day of work. 11 days passed in stages. Stage 1. The apprentices secretly rearranged the tower's pipes from the intake to the outlet and cast the missing spouts from temple bronze taken without permission. Stage 2. At night, Orin transcribes both of the soporific chants, each 12 sheets long, from the forbidden archives, while his wife, Mora, holds the light for him and remains silent. Only on the 7th night does she ask quietly if they'll make it in time. He replies that he doesn't know. It is the plain truth, and it is worse than a lie.
Third segment. On the 9th day, the sky in the north bursts into flame in broad daylight. Yes, a faint flash of lightning without thunder. The first exchange of blows between the fortresses over the ocean. By evening, a tidal wave from the north washes away Urna's lower docks, and the council finally believes, but it is already too late to believe. Scene 4. On the 11th day, the moon splits in 2. Orin was standing on the upper platform of the tower when it happened, and he remembered for the rest of his life how quiet it was. One of the fortresses, losing the battle, struck the other with everything it had and missed, firing high into the sky. The moon cracked with 3 silent cracks and began to drift apart slowly like melting ice. The sound came only after a while, and it was not a roar, but a moan of such depth that birds fell dead from the sky. And then the water began to rise. Not as a wave, with its entire mass. The shattered moon pulled the oceans differently, and the oceans surged onto the land from all directions at the pace of a walking man, with no intention of stopping. The victorious fortress died as well. The tower's ears heard its heart burst from its own overheating somewhere beyond the edge of the world. And the defeated one fell. It descended from the sky for 11 hours, as vast as a second continent, and Orin listened to its battle-beating heart the whole time. The heart did not die. Hearts of this power do not know how to die. It fell, driven to its limit by war, and continued to unleash a wave of destruction upon the world. Wherever it fell and continued to beat, the sea would rear up eternally until the heart was knocked out of rhythm. The fortress sank into the ocean 400 miles east of Urna, and the sun hid itself for 3 days following its fall. When the ash settled, the city stood submerged up to its 2nd stories, and the water kept rising. Every day, waves came from the east, driven by the heart beating at the bottom. The Council of Urna gathered on the upper tier of the temple for the last time, and now listened to the Master of Voices as it had never listened to anyone before. Orin told them the whole truth, that the land could not be saved. The moon is split, and the water will rise to the height of the mountains, and nothing will stop it. That people can be saved. On ships and on the peaks of the mountain ranges, people will survive the flood if they survive the sea. But the sea will not let them live as long as the fallen heart beats. Each of its beats is a storm without cause and waves without wind, and after a year of such a sea, survive. The heart cannot be killed. He repeated this twice because the young elder had asked about weapons. It cannot be done. It is not alive. It can only be put to sleep and kept in hibernation by a continuous melody. Always, for centuries. And he, the Master of Voices, Orin Geld, knows the melody and possesses a tower that he spent 11 days rebuilding from his ear to his throat. The council was silent for a long time. Then the oldest of the elders asked the only question that made sense to ask. Who would sing when everyone went upstairs? Orin replied that the machine would sing. The tower could be built to house the self-singing mechanism. The waves themselves would wind its mechanisms forever. But the machine could not be left alone. Bronze corrodes, and salt eats away at the pipes, and the structure deteriorates, and the machine needs caretakers who will remain below when the city is sealed with a dome and flooded up to the sky. They'll stay forever because there will be nowhere left to go up to and nothing to go up on. He said this calmly, though his hands on the edge of the table were clenched too tightly. The elder asked if he had found the caretakers. Oren replied that he would find them. He already knew that he would write his own name first on the list, and he knew that Mora and his 2 sons were waiting for him at home, and that tonight he would have to face the most terrifying conversation of his life. He was wrong about only one thing. The conversation was brief. Mora listened to him without interrupting, and his sons listened from behind the door, though they thought he didn't know. Then she said that the boys would go upstairs with her brother's ships, and that was final. She didn't say anything to herself. She simply took his work apron and her own out of the chest and hung them both next to the door. In the morning, Oren opened the first entry in his new journal, bound in celestial metal that does not corrode. He wrote that he was beginning the journal of Hor Irna, the keeper, that the song must always be heard, and that he knows no forgiveness for those who split the moon, but he knows one thing for certain. As long as the melody plays, destruction sleeps. The rest will be decided by those who come after, if they come. The city had been dying for 2 years, and all that time, Oren had been building within the dying city something that was meant to outlive everyone. The work raced against the water. The water rose a palm's width per day during calm weeks, and an elbow's width when the fallen heart in the east beat stronger than usual. Irna rose upward, floor by floor, like a person lifting their chin above the flood. The lower tiers surrendered to the sea without a fight. The middle tiers held out with dams as long as they could. Life was being squeezed into the central square, toward the temple and the tower, and on that small patch of land, the 20,000 remaining townspeople were building arks, dismantling their homes into planks, and saying goodbye to one another every day, because every week another caravan of ships set out toward the east, toward the mountain ranges that would become islands. Oren was building the dome. The plan was just crazy enough to be the only one possible. Not to save the tower from the water, to let the water in and trap a bubble of air above the heart of the city. Irna's temple dome had been built by the ancient powers from celestial stone, and it bore the weight of a mountain. Oren and his master builders extended it downward, lowering the dome's walls all the way to the square and transforming the temple and the tower into a single enclosed shell. When the sea rises higher, the shell will submerge entirely, with the air inside and the machine and the watchers, and will rest on the seabed as long as the stone stands. The tower's voices will be carried outward into the depths of the water through 1,000 pipes, for water carries the melody farther and more clearly than air. Thus was born what people would later call the chorus, though Oren wrote of it more simply in his journal, Irna's Singing Machine. 2 years passed in stages. Stage 1. The craftsmen tune 1,000 pipes for the water's song, and Oren personally checks each one against standard tuning forks made of celestial metal. Mora keeps track of the settings, and her handwriting in the journal is neater than his own. Second phase. The tuning of slumber proves more terrifying in practice than on record. The first time they start the machine at half power for a test, half the people in the room start nosebleeding, and 3 of the older craftsmen collapse and don't get back up. The melody is designed for the heart of power, not for people. Oren crosses out 1/3 of the score and writes alternative passages, reducing the power and extending the effect, and from these revisions emerged the 12 sheets that he will later transcribe neatly into the journal. Cut 3. The volunteers arrive. He thought he'd have to persuade the overseers, but he was wrong. 109 people arrive at the tower, all willing to stay below forever. And Oren selects 26, craftsmen, a healer, and 2 young singers with perfect pitch. He selects them based on a single criterion he does not record in his journal. He takes only those who have no one left above. he does not include himself or Mora in this principle, and this is the second decision for which he will not be the one to pay the price. Cut 4. At the end of the second year, the primordial mother arrives. The whales deserve a separate mention because without them, there would be nothing. The sea was going mad from the beats of the fallen heart, and all life within it was thrashing about and perishing, except for the whale clan. The whales were moving toward the source of the pain, not away from it. Orin noticed this in the first year. Huge shadows gathered in circles in the waters around the sinking Urna and lingered near the city, where the machine was already singing its trial notes at half strength. The young singer Yala was the first to say aloud what the masters were afraid to say. The whales don't just listen. The whales sing along. Their voices blended into the machine's harmony from below, supporting it in the depths of the water like the low register the pipes lacked. And at the end of the second year, when the water had already risen to the chest of the dome and the city above was burning out with the last fires of the last caravans, she came from the ocean, the one about whom the whale clan itself sang. She was already old even then. Her back, a quarter of a mile long, was overgrown with coral. Her scars were so ancient that they had become part of her, like riverbeds are part of the earth. She entered the waters of Urna at dawn and stood motionless above the flooded streets, and the entire clan fell silent around her. Orin went down to the water alone. He didn't know why. He only knew he couldn't help but go out. The Great Mother looked at him with an eye the size of a tower window, and in that eye was an expression he couldn't name then, and could only describe 20 years later in a journal. She looked the way a master craftsman looks at an apprentice who has taken on a task beyond his strength, without mockery, with pity and respect at the same time. And then she sang the score to him, his own lullaby, which the machine had been singing out in trials into the water for 2 years. She sang it from beginning to end without a single mistake, a single voice replacing 1,000 pipes. And in 2 places, she sang it differently. Orin stood knee-deep in the water with a wax tablet and wrote down her corrections with hands that wouldn't obey him. The first correction fell exactly where his melody had always drifted during rehearsals, a place he'd spent half a year trying to understand. The second was more subtle, and he didn't grasp its meaning until years later. The foremother corrected his score from memory, a memory older than the fallen fortress. Her lineage had sung lullabies to soothe ancient hearts when the heavenly powers had not yet been born. People did not invent the lullaby of the chorus. People overheard it from the whales and forgot from whom they had overheard it. In his journal that evening, Orin wrote the corrections in the margins of 12 pages and a single word beside them: whale. And below, he added a note for those who would come after. If the bronze dies, seek the voice of the lineage that remembers from the beginning. As long as her lineage lives, hope lives. The Great Mother departed at sunset, and her lineage followed her north, and Yal wept by the water without restraint. And a month later, the day of closure arrived. The last caravan had left for the highlands a week earlier. Orin's sons had gone with it. He forbade himself from describing the farewell in his journal and wrote only that the elder son did not look back, while the younger turned around 7 times, and that both had taken a tuning fork from the tower with them. 26 keepers, along with Orin and Mora, remained alone in the square in the entire city. The dome was lowered and sealed from the inside with a triple lock made of celestial stone, and Orin himself turned the final bolt, the sound of which haunted his dreams for the rest of his life. The gates were left with a single latch. From the inside, any guardian could open them just wide enough for a person to pass through. From the outside, no one could open them. This was Oren's third decision, and he had argued with the masters about it until he was hoarse. The masters wanted a permanent airtight seal. Oren insisted on a door. He told them the words that he later transcribed onto the first page of his journal. "We are locking not a crypt, but a post. A relief will one day arrive at the post. The door must wait for the relief, even if it has to wait 300 years." The water covered the dome 40 days later. The watchman listened to this from inside. Like the roar of the surf, at first from above, then from all around. Then not at all, because there is no surf at that depth. Erna sank to the bottom of the chasm between the ridges, whole, with her bubble of 300-year-old air and her machine. And on the first night at the bottom, Oren Geld stood at the tower's control panel in front of all 28 of them and brought the machine up to full power for the first time. 1,000 pipes fell into tune. The sound traveled into the depths through the open throats, settled on the water, and rolled eastward toward the fallen heart, 400 miles away. The reply came 6 hours later. The old tower's ears were still working, and Oren listened himself. The heartbeats in the east began to fade. Less frequent, softer. By dawn, according to the count, by which time there was no heart underwater, the heart beat for the last time and fell silent. Above, at that hour, a deathly silence fell over the entire ocean for the first time in 2 years, and caravans of refugees on all the waters wept and prayed in bewilderment. And below, beneath the dome, 28 people stood silently by the singing machine, and Mora took Oren's hand and said that now they could live. She was wrong about just one word. Now it was possible to serve. Service at the bottom turned out to be not a feat, but a craft, and therein lay its quiet, terrifying essence, which Oren came to understand by his 10th year. A feat ends. A craft endures. The dome lived by the schedule that Oren had drawn up in the first month, and which outlived him. Shifts at the machine lasted 4 hours. Pipe inspections. Tuning the system to tuning forks twice a day. The garden under the small dome, where luminous polyps replaced the sun and where vegetables and mushrooms grew in imported soil. Fresh water was supplied by a distillation coil. The air was purified by those same polyps, and its supply was considered eternal as long as the stone remained intact. Only one thing was not eternal: people and bronze. The years passed in segments, and the segments grew longer and longer. The first segment, the first decade. The caretakers still called the service temporary. Yala scratches a tally of days on the wall by the gate, then a tally of months, then stops. In the 7th year, the first of them dies, the old foundryman Bram, and he is buried at the foot of the machine according to a rite they make up on the spot, because no one has a right for such a funeral. From that day on, the dead are laid to rest by the column. The caretaker never leaves his post, and after Bram's death, Oren said this over his grave, and was startled by how matter-of-fact it sounded. Cut to the second scene, the 2nd and 3rd decades. Up above, they think of them less and less. In the early years, signs came from the surface. Caravans would drop cargo with letters and gifts over the chasm, and the caretakers would haul them up through a small gate via the airlock. Oren reread the letters from his sons until they were worn through. Then the letters grew fewer. Then they came from strangers. Then, in the 40th year, the last cargo drop fell from above, and inside lay not a message, but a prayer. Up above, a generation had grown up for whom Erna was no longer a city, but a legend, and Hor was no longer a machine, but the voice of the god of the depths. Oren read the prayer aloud to everyone, and Mora said that this was not oblivion. It was simply a different kind of memory. Cut 3. The bronze began to fade in the 61st year. The first pipe choked on salt rock in its throat. They cleared it out, but it choked again a year later, and for good. Oren recorded it in the logbook, coldly, as an entry. Pipe 406 died. The system is being maintained by 999. And below that, he jotted down the first calculation of what he hadn't dared to calculate before. If the deaths continue at this rate, the machine will maintain a clean system for 200 years and a dirty one for another 100. He crossed out the rest of the calculation sheets. Not because he had made a mistake. It was because further on began the arithmetic of hope, and he had forbidden himself that. The number of overseers was dwindling, and there were no new ones, nor could there be. By the 80th year, 11 remained. By the 100th, 5. People at the bottom lived longer than those at the top. The steady air, the steady days, and the polyphonic light stretched out life the way winter stretches it out in a den. But they didn't stretch it out indefinitely. Mora died in her 104th year of service, in her sleep, during a shift she refused to give up until the very end. Oren sang her funeral dirge alone, leading the entire machine formation in a memorial march of his own composition, and that was the only time in 300 years that the chorus sang off-score. He laid her to rest by the column alongside the others and wrote a single line in the log that day. Today I realized for whom I had kept the formation for 100 years. From now on, I'll keep the ranks for those I won't see. The last 2 other watchmen passed away in the 120th year within the same month. Yal, the old man with perfect pitch, died at the control panel, hearing, as he thought, wails in his final moments, and Oren didn't bother to check with the tower's ears whether it was true or a mercy of his fading hearing. The healer Sina slipped away quietly into among the garden beds, and Orengeld was left alone. Alone in all of Irna. Alone beneath the entire ocean. How he lived on afterward and for how long he himself did not know, because he had stopped keeping track of the days. Polypius, the light, the heavenly air, and something in the very structure of the machine, which he had listened to continuously for over a century, drew his life far beyond any human limit, and he did not know whether to give thanks for it or to curse it. He would get up, walk around the pipes, clean what he could. There was no one left to bury and no one to talk to, so he began talking to his journal. The entries from the last few decades were nothing like the early ones. He wrote to whoever might come. He explained the machine's workings in as much detail as one would explain to a child. He rewrote 12 pages of the score in fair copy 3 times while his hand was still steady. He redrew the map with the coordinates of what he called the Dome of the Abyss, because he decided not to drag the old name of the fallen fortress into the new world. Let destruction bear no name of a power. Let it simply be a place. He wrote down everything about the primordial mother's corrections and underlined the footnote at the passage where the machine always went off-key while her voice remained true, adding that he did not understand why and that whoever came after him should understand. He wrote about the guardians with pain. The old powers had left living sentinels behind in the flooded cities, serpent-like giants bred to guard the machines from the creatures of the depths. For the first centuries they served faithfully, and Oren heard their roll calls echoing between the cities through the towers. Then the distant machines began to die, one after another in other flooded cities where the watchers had been gone so long. And the sentinels, standing by the dead machines, went mad from the silence. Oren listened as city after city fell silent, and as the sentinels' roll call turned into a howl, and the howl into a silence worse than the howl. He wrote this down too, for whoever might come. The sentinels are not evil. The sentinels have been orphaned. If possible, do not kill them. Sing to them. The pipes were dying faster than he was. By the 200th year, 300 were singing. By the 250th, 110. The system had long been running rough, with workarounds that Oren patched together by hand, rerouting the living pipes to the dead voices, and each such adjustment cost him weeks of work that would once have taken a day. His hands remembered. His body was giving out. He caught himself sitting at the console without remembering how he'd sat down, and that these lapses were getting longer and longer. And then he made the last of his decisions. He prepared the post for handover to a shift he would never see. He opened the dome's gates just wide enough for a person to pass through and wedged them shut forever. He placed the logbook on the lectern in front of the column, open to the first page. He laid out spare tuning forks and the keys to all the machine's mechanisms in a conspicuous place. He swept the temple. He walked around the garden, the pipes, and the graves by the column one last time, saying goodbye to each one by name, and this took a whole day because there were 7. The last entry in the journal was written in a hand that was no longer steady, but still legible. He wrote that 7 pipes remained and that, by his reckoning, the dirty mechanism would last for decades more, and then the heart in the east would begin to hear through its sleep. That they could no longer build a machine of such power and let whoever follows in his footsteps not waste their life on it. That there is only one path. A living voice above the very heart in the dome of the abyss. The Great Mother, or her lineage, if the lineage lives on. That he, Orengeld, the first master of Erna's voices, served in his post longer than he dared ask of fate, and regrets none of his decisions, except one. He never found out whether his sons had survived. And if the one reading this was born under the open sky, it means someone survived. It means it was all not in vain. Sing. He did not die by the column where everyone else lay. He died on the top landing of the inner staircase, above the water that filled half the temple. There, where on the clearest days, a single blurred patch of light pierced through the thickness of the dome's crystal to reach the bottom. He sat facing that patch of light. 300 years later, 6 people in bone suits will climb that staircase and remove their helmets, and a young witch will take from the lectern a bound journal that the salt did not touch. By that day, 3 of the 1,000 pipes will be singing. The new guard will arrive at their post late in life, and yet just in time. The door will wait, and high above all the waters that night, just as on every night before it, there will be the usual silence of the usual sea. A silence that 28 people and 1 stubborn master bought for a world that did not notice the purchase. That silence is his monument. It has no name, nor does it need one. While the sea sleeps peacefully, Orengeld stands guard.